Welcome, kind listener, to this peaceful haven of history. This is a place where stories flow like a gentle river, carrying us far away from the rush of the present. Whether you are lying in bed, eyes growing heavy, or sitting quietly as the evening settles, know that you are among friends here. If you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from. I treasure the chance to see how history brings together people from every corner of the world. And if these calm journeys speak to you, go ahead and subscribe, so our paths may cross again in the chapters to come. But for now, let the noise of today drift away, and join me as we wander softly into the mists of the past. In the beginning, there was only chaos. Not chaos as we might think of it today, with its noise and confusion, but something deeper, older, more profound. The ancient Greeks imagined chaos as a vast, yawning emptiness, a cosmic void where nothing existed and yet everything was possible. It was the blank canvas before creation, the silence before the first word, the darkness before the first light. From this primordial emptiness, the first beings emerged, not through any act of will or design, but simply because existence itself demanded form. From chaos came Gaia, the earth herself, wide-bosomed and eternal, the foundation upon which all life would rest. She was not merely a goddess of the earth but the earth itself, every mountain and valley, every blade of grass and grain of sand. The ancient Greeks, when they walked upon the ground, felt they were walking upon a living being, something conscious and aware, something that could love and grieve and remember. Gaia emerged complete and whole, bringing with her the promise of life, of growth, of endless cycles of birth and death and rebirth. And with Gaia came others from that original void. Tartarus rose, or perhaps descended, a realm of shadows deep beneath the earth, a place of imprisonment and punishment that would later house the defeated Titans and the worst of creation's mistakes. Eros appeared, not yet the cherubic child of later tales, but a fundamental force of attraction and connection, the power that draws things together, that makes atoms bind and hearts yearn. And Erebus, the personification of darkness itself, and Nyx, the night, beautiful and terrible, wrapped in star-scattered robes that trailed across the heavens. These primordial beings were not quite gods as we would later understand them. They were more like principles, embodiments of the fundamental aspects of existence. They did not scheme or love or hate in human ways. They simply were, existing as the building blocks of reality itself. Yet even in their cosmic detachment, they began the work of creation, bringing forth new beings through their very existence. Gaia, alone and complete, gave birth to Uranus, the starry sky. He rose from her, matching her in scope and grandeur, until he arched over her, covering her completely. The earth and sky came together, and from their union, the world as the Greeks knew it began to take shape. But this was not a gentle courtship, not a tender romance. Uranus pressed himself upon Gaia constantly, desperately, without rest or respite, and from this endless union came the first children, beings of terrible power and strange form. The first of these children were the Titans, 12 mighty beings who embodied forces of nature and cosmic principles. There was Oceanus, the great river that encircled the world, and his sister Tethys, mother of all the earth's waters. There was Hyperion, the light, and his sister Thea, whose radiance would later shine through their children, the sun and moon. There was Ceus and Phoebe, embodiments of intellect and prophecy. There was Crius and Iapetus, less defined but no less powerful. There was Cronus, whose name meant time itself, crafty and ambitious. And there was Rhea, fertile and patient, who would become the mother of gods. But Uranus looked upon his children and felt not pride but fear. These beings, so powerful and strange, threatened his sovereignty, his control over all existence. So he took each child as it was born and pushed it back into Gaia's body, hiding them in the depths of the earth, in the dark places where light had never reached. 12 Titans he imprisoned thus, and Gaia groaned under the weight of them, her body stretched and aching with the burden of her hidden children. And there were other children too, stranger and more terrible. the Cyclopes came forth, 3 of them, each with a single eye in the center of their forehead, beings of immense strength who would later forge thunderbolts for the gods. Brontes, who brought thunder. Steripes, who brought lightning. Argesh, who brought brightness. These 2 Uranus thrust back into Gaia's depths, fearing their power, unable to bear the thought of beings who might rival his own might. Then came the Centimanes, the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers of overwhelming power. Each had 50 heads and 100 arms, beings of such strength that even the Titans would fear them. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges they were called, and they too Uranus imprisoned in the earth, unable to face the reality of what he had created. Gaia endured this suffering for ages uncounted. She felt her children moving within her, heard their cries, felt their frustration and rage. The earth itself groaned under the weight of this injustice, and finally, Gaia could bear it no longer. She reached deep within herself, into the very stone and metal of her being, and from her substance, she forged a great sickle, a weapon of adamant, harder than any metal that would later exist in the world. She called to her imprisoned children, her voice echoing through the caverns of the earth, and she asked them who would help her, who would take vengeance upon Uranus for his cruelty. Most of the Titans cowered in fear, unwilling to raise a hand against their father, the sky itself. But Cronus, the youngest, the craftiest, agreed. He took the sickle his mother offered him, and he waited. When Uranus next came to cover Gaia, Cronus emerged from his hiding place. With one swift motion, he swung the adamant sickle and castrated his father, severing Uranus from his power, ending his reign with a single terrible act. The severed parts fell, some upon the land, some into the sea, and from these pieces, new beings would later emerge. From the blood that fell upon Gaia came the giants, mighty beings who would one day make war upon the gods. From the blood came the Furies, the Erinyes, spirits of vengeance who would pursue those who committed crimes against family and nature. And from the parts that fell into the sea, mingling with the foam and spray, would eventually rise Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, born from violence and pain yet embodying pleasure and desire. Uranus, wounded and diminished, retreated to the farthest reaches of the cosmos. As he withdrew, he pronounced a curse upon Cronus, telling him that he too would one day be overthrown by his own children, that the cycle of violence and rebellion would continue. But Cronus, flush with victory, paid little heed to his father's words. He had freed himself and his siblings from their prison, and now the Titans would rule. The age of the Titans began, and for countless years, they reigned over the cosmos. Cronus took his sister Rhea as his wife, and together they ruled, with the other Titans dividing the world among themselves. Oceanus and Tethys governed the waters, giving birth to the 3,000 Oceanids, nymphs of rivers and streams and springs. Hyperion and Thea brought forth Helios, the sun, who drove his chariot across the sky each day, and Selene, the moon, who traced her path through the night, and Eos, the rosy-fingered dawn, who opened the gates of heaven each morning. It was an age of elemental powers, when the forces of nature walked in forms that were almost but not quite like the gods that would come later. The Titans were more distant, more cosmic, less concerned with the affairs of mortals because mortals did not yet exist. This was a time of vast, slow movements, of continental forces, of the establishment of the fundamental order of the world. But Cronus remembered his father's curse. As his rule stretched on, the words gnawed at him, filling him with paranoia and dread. When Rhea became pregnant with their first child, Cronus made a terrible decision. He would not be overthrown as his father had been. He would prevent the prophecy from ever coming true. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Hestia, Cronus took the infant and swallowed her whole, imprisoning her in his belly as he himself had once been imprisoned in the earth. Rhea grieved, but what could she do against her husband's power? When she bore their second child, Demeter, the same fate befell the infant. Then came Hera, and she too disappeared into Cronus's darkness. Then Hades, the dark-eyed lord, was consumed. Then Poseidon, lord of seas yet to be, was swallowed down. 5 children Cronus devoured, and 5 children lived on, undying within their father's body, trapped in a darkness without end, waiting, growing, plotting. When Rhea became pregnant with her 6th child, her grief turned to cunning. She remembered her own mother's pain, how Gaia had suffered with her children imprisoned within her. Rhea would not let this child be taken. She sought out Gaia, who advised her to travel to Crete, to a sacred cave on Mount Dicte, where the child could be born in secret. There, in the darkness of the cave, with only the divine attendants to help her, Rhea gave birth to Zeus. The infant's cries echoed off the stone walls, and Rhea knew that she must act quickly before Cronus discovered the deception. She took a large stone and wrapped it in swaddling clothes, making it look like an infant. Then she returned to Cronus and presented him with the bundle. Without even looking, so confident was he in his cruelty, Cronus swallowed the stone whole, believing he had consumed his 6th child. Zeus remained in the cave in Crete, hidden from his father, nursed by the nymph Amalthea. In some versions of the story, Amalthea was a goat whose milk fed the infant god. In others, she was a nymph who brought him the milk of a divine goat. The bees of the mountain brought him honey, and when he cried, the Curetes, young warriors devoted to Rhea, clashed their spears against their shields, drowning out the sound so that Cronus would not hear. Zeus grew quickly, as divine children do, nourished on ambrosia and nectar, breathing the clean mountain air, learning the ways of the world from the nymphs and spirits who attended him. He grew strong and clever, patient and bold, watching and waiting for the right moment to challenge his father and free his siblings. When Zeus reached maturity, he left the cave and sought out Metis, a Titaness whose name meant cunning intelligence. She mixed for him a potion, a brew that would cause even a Titan to regurgitate what he had swallowed. Zeus then approached his father, disguising himself as a cupbearer, and offered Cronus a drink. The Titan king, suspicious of everyone except those he believed were beneath him, drank deeply. The effect was immediate and violent. Cronus felt his stomach heave and convulse. First came the stone, the one he had swallowed last, still wrapped in its now ancient swaddling clothes. Then came Poseidon, full-grown and furious, emerging from his father's throat with rage in his eyes. Then Hades, dark and grim, ascending from the depths of Cronus's belly. Then came Hera, Demeter, and Hestia, each of them fully grown, each of them having spent ages imprisoned in darkness, each of them ready for vengeance. The 6 children of Cronus and Rhea stood together for the first time, facing their father. And Cronus, seeing them, knew that the prophecy was coming true, that his reign was ending, that the cycle his father had predicted would indeed come to pass. He called out to his siblings, the other Titans, and they rallied to him. Atlas, who would later bear the weight of the sky. Prometheus, the forward thinker, who could see the shape of things to come. Epimetheus, the afterthinker. Menoetius the violent. Many of the Titans stood with Cronus, unwilling to yield their power to this new generation. But not all the Titans supported Cronus. Oceanus refused to fight, remaining neutral in his watery realm. Some of the Titanesses sided with the younger gods or remained apart from the conflict. And Zeus convinced his uncles, the Cyclopes and the Centimanes, to join his cause. He descended into Tartarus and freed them from the prison where Cronus had left them after overthrowing Uranus. In gratitude, the Cyclopes forged weapons for the new gods. For Zeus, they made the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure lightning that could shatter mountains. For Poseidon, they crafted a trident that could shake the earth and raise waves. For Hades, they fashioned a helmet of invisibility, allowing him to move unseen through the world. Thus began the Titanomachy, the war between the Titans and the Olympians, a conflict that would rage for 10 years and reshape the cosmos. The battles were fought across the heavens and the earth, with mountains thrown like stones and rivers boiled away to nothing. Zeus hurled his thunderbolts, splitting the sky with light and sound. Poseidon struck the earth with his trident, calling up earthquakes and floods. The Centimanes hurled rocks by the hundred, their many arms working in constant motion, creating storms of stone that crushed the Titans' forces. The world itself became the battlefield. Forests burned. Seas evaporated and returned. The very fabric of reality trembled under the weight of such cosmic violence. The Titans fought with the strength of the old world, with the power of elements and time itself. But the Olympians fought with something new, something the Titans had never fully understood: cunning, cooperation, the ability to change and adapt. Gradually, slowly, the Olympians gained the advantage. One by one, the Titans fell or surrendered. Atlas, who had fought most fiercely against the new order, was given a special punishment. He was condemned to hold up the sky for all eternity, bearing the weight of the heavens on his shoulders, never resting, never able to set down his burden. The other defeated Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, in the same depths where the Cyclopes and Centimanes had once been held. The Centimanes became their jailers, ensuring that the old gods would never rise again. Cronus himself was cast down into that deepest darkness, overthrown by his son just as he had overthrown his father, the prophecy fulfilled despite all his efforts to prevent it. Some later tales would say that Cronus eventually found peace in Tartarus, that he became a king of a blessed realm where favored mortals would go after death. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, he was simply defeated, removed from power, his age ended. With the Titans defeated, Zeus and his siblings divided the cosmos among themselves. They drew lots to determine who would rule what realm. Zeus received the sky, becoming king of the gods, master of storms and weather, wielder of the thunderbolt. His word would be law, his throne the highest on Mount Olympus, the great mountain that touched the heavens. Poseidon received the seas, all the waters of the earth, the storms and earthquakes, the horses of the waves. His palace would be built in the depths of the ocean, made of coral and pearl, where he would rule over all the creatures of the sea. Hades received the underworld, the realm of the dead, the dark kingdom beneath the earth where all mortals must eventually go. His was not a punishment but an honor, for without death, life would have no meaning, no urgency, no precious brevity. The three sisters received their domains as well, though the ancient Greeks saw them as less defined by territory than by function. Hestia became the goddess of the hearth, of the home fire that was the center of family life, of the sacred flame that burned in every city center. She was the firstborn and the last to emerge from Cronus, and she chose to remain virginal, devoted entirely to her role as keeper of sacred fire. Demeter became the goddess of the harvest, of grain and agriculture, of the cycles of planting and reaping that would sustain mortal life. Hera became the queen of the gods, wife to Zeus, though their marriage would be stormy and complex, filled with love and conflict in equal measure. These six were the first Olympians, the primary gods of the new order. But their family would grow, and with each new addition, the world would gain new dimensions, new possibilities, new stories. Zeus, as king of the gods, took many lovers, both divine and mortal. His first wife, according to most accounts, was Metis, the Titaness who had helped him defeat Cronus. Metis was wisdom itself, cunning intelligence, the ability to think and plan and foresee. She became pregnant with Zeus's child, but Zeus received a prophecy similar to the one that had plagued his father. He was told that Metis would bear first a daughter, and then a son, and that son would overthrow Zeus just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus, just as Cronus had overthrown Uranus. Zeus, learning nothing from his father's example, decided to prevent the prophecy in the most direct way possible. He swallowed Metis whole, taking her wisdom into himself, preventing her son from ever being born. But Metis's daughter was already growing, and divine children are not so easily stopped. The child developed inside Zeus himself, growing in his head, until one day Zeus was struck with a terrible headache, a pain so intense that he cried out to Hephaestus, the smith god, to help him. Hephaestus took an axe and, with a mighty blow, split Zeus's head open. From the wound emerged Athena, fully grown, fully armored, crying a war cry that echoed across the heavens. She was born from Zeus alone, without a mother in the traditional sense, embodying wisdom and strategic warfare, the civilized aspects of conflict rather than its pure bloodlust. She became Zeus's favorite child, the one who would never be denied anything she asked, the goddess who would become the patron of Athens, the wisest city in Greece. Zeus's relationship with Hera was more traditional but far more complicated. Hera was his sister, which was not unusual among the gods, and she was beautiful, powerful, and proud. Zeus pursued her relentlessly, but Hera refused him again and again. Finally, Zeus transformed himself into a small bird, a cuckoo, bedraggled and cold, and appeared before Hera during a storm. Taking pity on the creature, Hera held it close to warm it, and Zeus revealed himself, using her moment of compassion to finally claim her. They married in a grand ceremony, and Hera became queen of the gods, goddess of marriage and childbirth, protector of wives and families. But Zeus could not remain faithful. His eye wandered constantly, finding beauty in goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women. He would transform himself into various forms to seduce or abduct his lovers, a bull, a swan, a shower of gold, a cloud. Each affair enraged Hera, but she could not directly punish Zeus, who was more powerful than she. Instead, she turned her wrath upon his lovers and their children, pursuing them with jealous fury, making their lives bitter with suffering. From the union of Zeus and Hera came several children. Ares was born, the god of war, not the strategic warfare that Athena embodied but the chaos and bloodlust of battle, the rage and violence that consumed men in combat. The Greeks had an ambivalent relationship with Ares, respecting his power but fearing and often disliking his influence. He was necessary but not beloved. Hebe was born, the goddess of youth, who served nectar to the gods on Olympus, keeping them eternally young and vital. She was gentle and kind, eventually marrying the hero Heracles after his apotheosis. Eileithyia was born, the goddess of childbirth, who assisted women in labor, sometimes easing their pain, sometimes, at Hera's command, prolonging it to punish Zeus's lovers. And there was Hephaestus, the smith god, master craftsman of the divine realm. His birth was unusual and tragic. In some versions, Hera bore him alone, without Zeus, trying to match her husband's feat in producing Athena. In others, he was the son of both, but when he was born lame, deformed, not perfect as a god should be, Hera was disgusted and threw him from Olympus. He fell for a full day, landing in the sea, where he was rescued by Thetis, a sea nymph who would later become the mother of Achilles. Thetis raised Hephaestus in a hidden grotto beneath the ocean, and there he discovered his talent for smithing. He created wonders from metal and stone, learning to shape the elements into objects of beauty and power. When he was grown, he returned to Olympus with a gift for his mother, a beautiful golden throne. Hera, pleased, sat upon it immediately, only to discover that she was trapped, held by invisible chains that Hephaestus had cunningly woven into the throne's design. The gods begged Hephaestus to release her, but he refused, still bitter about being cast out. Finally, Dionysus, the god of wine, got Hephaestus drunk and convinced him to return to Olympus and free Hera. In exchange, Hephaestus was given a place among the Olympians and was promised Aphrodite as his wife, though that marriage would be troubled by her many infidelities, particularly her affair with Ares. Hephaestus made his home in a forge beneath Mount Olympus, or perhaps within a volcano, where he crafted the weapons and tools of the gods. He made Zeus's thunderbolts when the Cyclopes were not available. He made Achilles' armor at Thetis's request. He made Pandora, the first woman, at Zeus's command. Everything he created was imbued with divine power, perfect in form and function. Zeus's other children came from his many affairs, and they filled out the pantheon of Olympian gods. With the Titaness Leto, he fathered twins, Apollo and Artemis. Leto's pregnancy enraged Hera, who decreed that Leto would not be allowed to give birth on any land under the sun. Leto wandered in agony, unable to deliver her children, until she finally found Delos, a floating island that was not technically land in the traditional sense. There, clinging to a palm tree, she gave birth first to Artemis, and then, with Artemis acting as midwife, to Apollo. Artemis became the goddess of the hunt, of wild animals, of the moon, of childbirth and virginity. She roamed the forests with a band of nymphs who had sworn to remain virgins as she had. She was fierce and independent, quick to anger when men saw her bathing or when they harmed her sacred animals. She carried a silver bow and arrows that never missed their mark, and she was both protector and punisher, nurturing the young of animals while hunting the adults, helping women through childbirth while striking them down if they offended her. Apollo became the god of light, of music, of prophecy, of healing and plague, of rational thought and artistic inspiration. He was beautiful beyond measure, skilled with the bow and the lyre, able to see the future and speak truth through oracles. His main sanctuary was at Delphi, where the Pythia, his priestess, would breathe fumes from the earth and speak his prophecies in riddles and verses. Kings and common people alike would travel to Delphi to seek Apollo's wisdom, offering sacrifices and treasures in exchange for glimpses of what was to come. Apollo and Artemis were twins but opposites in many ways, he the sun, she the moon, he the rational, she the wild, he of civilization, she of nature. Yet they were devoted to each other, and woe to anyone who harmed one in the other's sight. When the giant Tityos tried to assault Leto, both twins shot him full of arrows and sent him to Tartarus, where he was pinned down while vultures eternally ate his liver. With the nymph Maia, Zeus fathered Hermes, born in a cave on Mount Cyllene. Hermes showed his cunning nature from his first day of life. While still an infant, he crept out of his cradle, found a tortoise, killed it, and used its shell to invent the first lyre, stringing it with sheep gut. Then, still on that first day, he stole Apollo's cattle, driving them backward so their hoofprints would suggest they had walked in the opposite direction, and hiding them in a cave. Apollo, god of prophecy, quickly discovered who had taken his cattle and confronted the infant Hermes. But Hermes was charming and persuasive even then, and when he played his newly invented lyre for Apollo, the older god was so enchanted by the music that he agreed to let Hermes keep the cattle in exchange for the instrument. Zeus, amused by his son's precocious talent for thievery and persuasion, made Hermes the messenger of the gods, the patron of travelers, merchants, thieves, and anyone who crossed boundaries. Hermes wore winged sandals that allowed him to fly, carried a caduceus, a staff entwined with two serpents, and wore a wide-brimmed traveler's hat. He guided souls to the underworld, carried messages between gods and mortals, protected those on journeys, and blessed commercial transactions. He was quick-witted and nimble, always moving, always connecting, the ultimate intermediary in a world of boundaries and divisions. Then there was Dionysus, whose birth was among the strangest of all the gods. Zeus fell in love with Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes. Hera, learning of the affair, disguised herself as Semele's old nurse and convinced the young woman to ask Zeus to appear before her in his true form. Zeus had promised to grant Semele any wish, and bound by his oath, he revealed himself as he truly was, pure divine energy, lightning and thunder and overwhelming power. Semele, being mortal, could not withstand such glory and was incinerated instantly. But Semele was pregnant with Zeus's child, and as she burned, Zeus snatched the unborn infant from her womb and sewed him into his own thigh. There Dionysus gestated for the remaining months, and when the time came, Zeus gave birth to him from his leg. Thus Dionysus was twice born, both from his mother and from his father, a god but one who had mortal origins. Dionysus became the god of wine, of ecstasy, of theater and ritual madness. He taught humans how to cultivate grapes and make wine, and he traveled the world spreading his mysteries, his rites, his transcendent celebrations. His followers, mostly women called Maenads or Bacchants, would work themselves into ecstatic frenzies, dancing through the night, tearing apart animals with their bare hands, experiencing divine madness that lifted them beyond their normal selves. Dionysus was liberation from constraint, the breaking of boundaries, the acknowledgement that civilization and rational control were not the whole of human experience. He could be gentle and generous or terrifying and destructive, depending on how he was received. These were the 12 Olympians, though the exact list varied depending on which region of Greece you asked and when. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, and either Hestia or Dionysus, with Hestia sometimes yielding her place to the younger god. They dwelt on Mount Olympus, a real mountain in northern Greece but also a cosmic realm, a place where the divine and earthly overlapped, where the gods could observe humanity and intervene as they saw fit. Life on Olympus was grand and strange. The gods feasted on ambrosia and nectar, food and drink that sustained their immortality and gave them strength. They squabbled and loved, formed factions and alliances, held councils where they debated the fates of mortals and the course of natural events. Zeus presided over these gatherings, though his authority was not absolute. The other gods could argue with him, resist him, even deceive him if they were clever enough. Divine politics were complex, driven by personality and passion as much as by power and position. But the gods did not exist in isolation. They were intimately connected to the world below, to the earth and sea and sky, and most importantly, to humanity. The creation of humans was itself a story layered with meaning. After the Olympians defeated the Titans, they set about populating the earth with mortal beings, creatures who would worship them, offer them sacrifices, give meaning and purpose to the divine realm. The Titan Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, took a special interest in these new creations. He shaped humans from clay, forming them in the image of the gods, and Athena breathed life into them. But humans were weak and vulnerable, lacking fur or claws, unable to survive without help. Prometheus pitted them and stole fire from the gods, bringing it down to earth hidden in a hollow fennel stalk. He gave humans this precious gift, along with knowledge of technology, arts, and civilization. Zeus was furious when he discovered what Prometheus had done. Fire was the domain of the gods, a symbol of their power and superiority. By giving it to humans, Prometheus had elevated mortals, made them capable of crafting tools and weapons, of cooking food and warming themselves, of creating art and technology. Zeus punished Prometheus by having him chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where an eagle would come each day to eat his liver. Because Prometheus was immortal, the liver would regenerate each night, and the torture would begin anew each morning, continuing for thousands of years until Heracles eventually freed him. But Zeus's punishment did not end with Prometheus. He also sought to punish humanity for accepting the stolen fire. He commanded Hephaestus to create the first woman, fashioning her from clay as Prometheus had fashioned the first man. Each god gave her a gift. Aphrodite gave her beauty and desire, Hermes gave her a cunning mind and persuasive words, Athena taught her weaving and crafts. They dressed her in fine clothes and called her Pandora, which meant all-gifted. Zeus sent Pandora to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, whose name meant afterthought because he only understood the consequences of actions after they had occurred. Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept a gift from Zeus, but when Epimetheus saw Pandora, he was so enchanted by her beauty that he forgot his brother's warning and welcomed her into his home. Pandora came with a large jar, often mistranslated as a box, which Zeus had given her with strict instructions never to open. But curiosity gnawed at Pandora, and one day, unable to resist any longer, she lifted the lid. Out flew all the evils that would plague humanity, disease and death, envy and hatred, pain and suffering, greed and cruelty. They scattered across the earth, infecting human life with misery and hardship. Pandora, horrified, slammed the lid shut, but it was too late. Only one thing remained in the jar: hope, or perhaps in some interpretations, deceptive expectation. Whether hope was the one blessing left to humanity or simply another form of torture, the greatest evil of all because it keeps humans striving despite their inevitable suffering, remained ambiguous, a question each person had to answer for themselves. Thus humanity entered an age of struggle, no longer innocent, burdened with knowledge and suffering, but also possessed of hope and fire, able to build and create, to strive against fate even knowing that death would ultimately claim them. The relationship between humans and gods became defined by sacrifice and prayer, with mortals offering portions of their food and drink to the gods, burning the fat and bones on altars, sending the smoke up to Olympus where the gods would breathe in the savory smell and be pleased. The gods, for their part, involved themselves constantly in human affairs. They fell in love with mortals, producing demigods, heroes who were greater than ordinary humans but not quite divine. They took sides in human conflicts, supporting some cities and families while opposing others. They appeared in disguise to test human virtue, rewarding those who showed proper hospitality and punishing those who were cruel or impious. They sent signs and omens, spoke through oracles, intervened in battles, and shaped the course of history according to their whims and desires. Among the many children of gods and mortals, few were as famous or as tragic as Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules. His story embodied the Greek ideal of heroism, overwhelming strength combined with flawed humanity, greatness achieved through suffering and perseverance. Heracles was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman of great beauty and virtue. Zeus had disguised himself as Alcmene's husband Amphitryon, extending a single night to the length of 3 so he could spend more time with her. When Heracles was born, Hera's jealousy flared once more. She sent 2 serpents to kill the infant in his cradle, but even as a baby, Heracles possessed tremendous strength. He grabbed the serpents, one in each hand, and strangled them, laughing as they writhed in his tiny fists. As Heracles grew, his strength became legendary. He was trained by the greatest teachers. Chiron the centaur taught him wisdom and medicine, Castor taught him combat, Apollo himself taught him archery. But Heracles also had a violent temper, and in his youth, he killed his music teacher Linus by striking him with a lyre during a lesson. This crime forced him to leave his home, and he spent time in the wilderness, wrestling lions and clearing the land of dangerous beasts. When Heracles married Megara, the daughter of a king, and fathered children with her, it seemed he might settle into a peaceful life. But Hera was not finished with him. She sent upon him a fit of madness so terrible that he could not distinguish his loved ones from enemies. In his delirium, Heracles killed Megara and his children, believing he was fighting monsters. When the madness lifted and he saw what he had done, his grief and horror were absolute. Seeking redemption, Heracles traveled to Delphi to consult Apollo's oracle. The Pythia told him that he must place himself in service to Hyscus and Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns, and perform whatever labors the king demanded of him. If he succeeded in these tasks, he would be purified of his crime and achieve immortality. And so began the famous 12 labors of Heracles, tasks designed by Eurystheus to be impossible, challenges that would break any lesser hero. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a monstrous beast whose golden hide could not be pierced by any weapon. Heracles tracked the lion to its cave, and when his arrows bounced harmlessly off its pelt, he wrestled the creature with his bare hands, choking the life from it with his tremendous strength. Afterward, he used the lion's own claws to skin it, and from that day forward, he wore the lion's pelt as armor, with its head serving as a helmet. The second labor sent him to kill the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent with 9 heads that lived in a poisonous swamp. This creature was especially dangerous because whenever one of its heads was cut off, 2 more would grow in its place. Heracles battled the Hydra with the help of his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized each neck stump with a torch after Heracles severed the head, preventing new heads from sprouting. One of the Hydra's heads was immortal, so Heracles buried it under a massive rock. He then dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, making them deadly weapons for future battles. The third labor required him to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer with golden antlers that belonged to Artemis. Heracles pursued the deer for an entire year, chasing it across mountains and valleys without rest, until finally it grew tired enough for him to catch it. He was careful not to harm the sacred animal, carrying it back alive to Eurystheus, and Artemis forgave him for the temporary capture since he had shown proper reverence. The fourth labor was to capture the Erymanthian boar, another mighty beast that terrorized the countryside. Heracles chased the boar through deep snow until it was exhausted, then bound it in chains and carried it back to Eurystheus, who was so frightened by the sight of the creature that he hid in a large bronze jar. For the fifth labor, Heracles was ordered to clean the Augean stables in a single day. King Augeas owned vast herds of cattle, and their stables had not been cleaned in 30 years. The filth was piled so high that the task seemed impossible. But Heracles used his intelligence as well as his strength. He diverted two rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, causing their waters to flow through the stables and wash away decades of accumulated waste in a few hours. The sixth labor sent him to drive away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and sharp metallic feathers they could launch like arrows. These birds had taken over a swamp and terrorized the region. Heracles received bronze castanets from Athena, and he used them to create such a loud noise that the birds were startled into flight. As they took to the air, he shot them down with his arrows, one after another, until the survivors fled and never returned. The seventh labor was to capture the Cretan bull, a magnificent beast that was causing destruction on the island of Crete. Some said this was the same bull that had fathered the Minotaur, the monster that lived in the labyrinth at Knossos. Heracles wrestled the bull into submission, then sailed with it back to the mainland and presented it to Eurystheus. For the eighth labor, Heracles had to capture the mares of Diomedes, horses that fed on human flesh. Their owner, King Diomedes, kept them wild and vicious, feeding them the flesh of his guests. Heracles defeated Diomedes in combat and fed the king to his own mares. Once the horses had eaten their fill, they became calm enough to be captured and brought back to Eurystheus. The ninth labor required him to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The Amazons were a tribe of warrior women who lived without men, fierce fighters who trained from childhood in combat. Hippolyta was willing to give Heracles her girdle peacefully, impressed by his reputation and strength. But Hera, still seeking to torment Heracles, disguised herself as an Amazon and spread a rumor that Heracles planned to kidnap their queen. The Amazons attacked, and in the ensuing battle, Heracles killed Hippolyta, believing she had betrayed him. He took the girdle from her body, completing his task but adding another tragedy to his long list of sorrows. The 10th labor sent him far to the west, to the island of Erythea, where the giant Geryon kept a herd of magnificent red cattle. Geryon had 3 bodies joined at the waist, making him a formidable opponent. Heracles had to defeat not only Geryon but also his 2-headed dog Orthrus and a giant herdsman. He killed them all and drove the cattle back across the Mediterranean, through Europe, a journey that took years and involved many additional adventures. The 11th labor was one of the most difficult, to steal the golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. These apples grew on a tree that Gaia had given to Hera as a wedding gift, and they granted immortality to anyone who ate them. The garden was located at the western edge of the world, and the apples were guarded by the Hesperides, nymphs who were daughters of Atlas, and by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon that never slept. Heracles did not know where the garden was located, so he first had to capture Nereus, the old man of the sea, who could change his shape but would answer questions if held firmly enough. After learning the location, Heracles traveled to the place where Atlas held up the sky. He convinced Atlas to retrieve the apples for him, offering to hold up the sky while Atlas was gone. Atlas agreed, glad for a respite from his burden, and went to the garden. When he returned with the apples, he said he would deliver them to Eurystheus himself and leave Heracles holding the sky forever. But Heracles, using cunning rather than strength, asked Atlas to hold the sky for just a moment while he adjusted his cloak for better padding. Atlas took back the burden, and Heracles quickly grabbed the apples and departed. The 12th and final labor was the most dangerous of all, to descend into the underworld and capture Cerberus, the three-headed dog that guarded the gates of Hades' realm. No living person was supposed to enter the underworld and return, but Heracles, with the permission of the gods, made the journey down. He met with Hades and Persephone, the king and queen of the dead, and asked to borrow Cerberus. Hades agreed on one condition: Heracles must subdue the beast without using any weapons. Heracles found Cerberus at the gates of the underworld, where the dog prevented the dead from leaving and the living from entering. Despite Cerberus's 3 heads, each filled with vicious teeth, and his serpent's tail, Heracles wrestled him into submission through sheer strength and determination. He carried the beast back to the surface and showed it to Eurystheus, who once again hid in his bronze jar in terror. Heracles then returned Cerberus to the underworld, completing his 12 labors and earning his purification. But Heracles' story did not end with the labors. His life continued to be marked by great deeds and terrible tragedies. He participated in the voyage of the Argo alongside Jason and the other Argonauts. He rescued Prometheus from his eternal punishment, shooting down the eagle that tormented the Titan. He fought giants and monsters, defended cities, and fathered numerous children. Eventually, Heracles married again, taking as his wife Deianira, a princess he won by defeating a river god for her hand. They lived happily for some time, but one day they came to a river where a centaur named Nessus offered to carry Deianira across while Heracles swam. When Nessus reached the far shore, he tried to assault Deianira, and Heracles shot him with one of his poison-tipped arrows. As Nessus lay dying, he told Deianira that if she ever feared losing Heracles' love, she should take some of his blood and use it as a love charm on Heracles' clothing. The centaur was lying, seeking vengeance even in death. His blood was now mixed with the Hydra's poison from Heracles' arrow, and it was not a love charm but a deadly toxin. Years later, when Deianira heard that Heracles had fallen in love with another woman, she remembered Nessus's advice. She took a robe and soaked it in the centaur's blood, then sent it to Heracles as a gift. When Heracles put on the robe, the poison immediately began to burn his flesh, adhering to his skin so that he could not remove it. The pain was unbearable, beyond anything he had endured in all his trials. He tried to tear off the robe, but it took his skin with it. He tried to cool the burning in a river, but water only intensified the poison's effects. Knowing he was dying, and that death would be slow and agonizing, Heracles built a funeral pyre on Mount Ida. He lay down upon the wood and asked someone to light it. Finally, a passing shepherd agreed, and as the flames rose, Heracles' mortal body burned away. But his divine essence, inherited from Zeus, could not die. In a blaze of lightning, Zeus took his son's immortal part up to Olympus, where Heracles was at last granted full godhood, reconciled even with Hera, and married to Hebe, the goddess of youth. His suffering was ended, his apotheosis complete. The story of Heracles illustrated a central theme in Greek mythology. The hero's path was always one of suffering and perseverance, of strength tested not just in combat but in endurance of pain, loss, and moral complexity. The greatest heroes were those who bore their burdens without surrender, who continued despite knowing that suffering was inevitable. Another great hero whose story captivated the Greek imagination was Perseus, whose life began with a prophecy and a desperate attempt to avoid it. Acrisius, king of Argos, learned from an oracle that he would be killed by his own grandson. To prevent this fate, he locked his daughter Danae in a bronze chamber underground, where no man could reach her. But Zeus saw Danae's beauty and came to her as a shower of golden light, pouring through the cracks in her prison. From this union, Perseus was born. When Acrisius discovered that Danae had borne a son, he did not want to kill them directly, fearing the gods' wrath for spilling the blood of his family. Instead, he sealed Danae and infant Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, leaving their fate to chance and the gods. The chest floated for days until it washed ashore on the island of Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys found them and took them into his home. Perseus grew up on Seriphos, raised by his mother and protected by Dictys. But when Perseus became a young man, Polydectes, the king of the island and Dictys' brother, fell in love with Danae. Perseus defended his mother from the king's unwanted advances, and Polydectes, seeking to remove the young hero, devised a plan. He announced that he would marry another woman and demanded wedding gifts from all his subjects. Perseus, having no wealth to offer, boasted that he could bring back anything the king desired, even the head of Medusa the Gorgon. Polydectes immediately held him to this boast. The Gorgons were three sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa, who lived at the edge of the world. They had writhing snakes for hair, bronze hands, golden wings, and most terrible of all, anyone who looked directly at them would instantly turn to stone. Medusa was the only one of the three who was mortal, though she had once been a beautiful priestess of Athena. Poseidon had assaulted her in Athena's temple, and Athena, unable to punish Poseidon, had transformed Medusa into a monster instead, a cruel injustice that Medusa bore with her monstrous form. Perseus's task seemed impossible, but the gods favored him. Athena appeared to him, still angry at Medusa for the defilement of her temple, and gave him a polished bronze shield. Hermes came as well, bringing winged sandals that would allow Perseus to fly, and he told Perseus where to find the Graeae, ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth among them and who alone knew where the Gorgons lived. Perseus found the Graeae and, while they were passing their shared eye from one to another, snatched it away. He refused to return it until they told him how to find the Gorgons and where to obtain three other items he would need: a cap of invisibility owned by Hades, a special pouch to safely carry Medusa's head, and a curved sword sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's scales. Armed with these divine gifts, Perseus flew to the edge of the world where the Gorgons dwelt. He found them sleeping among statues, the petrified remains of previous warriors who had tried and failed to kill them. Perseus approached carefully, looking only at Medusa's reflection in his polished shield, never directly at her. He raised his sword and, with a single swift stroke, severed her head. As Medusa's blood spilled upon the earth, two beings emerged from her body: Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword, both of them offspring of her union with Poseidon. Perseus quickly placed Medusa's head in his pouch and fled before the other Gorgons could awaken and pursue him. He flew over Libya, and drops of Medusa's blood fell from the pouch onto the desert sands, transforming into venomous snakes that would forever after inhabit that region. He flew over Ethiopia, where he saw a beautiful woman chained to rocks by the sea. This was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Cassiopeia had boasted that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs who were daughters of Nereus. The Nereids, offended, complained to Poseidon, who sent a sea monster to ravage the Ethiopian coast. An oracle told Cepheus that the only way to appease Poseidon was to sacrifice Andromeda to the monster. So the princess was chained to the rocks, dressed in her finest clothes, left as an offering to save her people. Perseus saw Andromeda and immediately fell in love with her. He descended and asked Cepheus for her hand in marriage, promising to save her from the monster. The king agreed desperately, and when the sea monster emerged from the depths, Perseus flew into battle. Some accounts say he used Medusa's head to turn the monster to stone. Others say he fought it with his curved sword, dodging its attacks with his winged sandals, striking again and again until the creature died. Either way, he freed Andromeda and claimed her as his bride. But at the wedding feast, Phineus, who had been betrothed to Andromeda before the monster's attack, arrived with armed men to take her by force. A great battle erupted in the hall, and Perseus, outnumbered, finally drew Medusa's head from its pouch. He warned those who supported him to look away, then held up the severed head. Phineus and all his men were instantly turned to stone, frozen forever in their aggressive poses. Perseus returned to Seriphos with Andromeda as his wife, only to find that Polydex had been harassing Danae in his absence, trying to force her to marry him. Perseus went to the king's palace where Polydex was holding a feast. When the king mocked Perseus, saying he had surely failed in his quest, Perseus revealed Medusa's head. Polydex and all his cruel followers turned to stone. Perseus then gave the head to Athena, who placed it on her aegis, her shield, where it would forever serve as a weapon and a warning. Having completed his quest, Perseus wanted to return to his homeland of Argos. But when his grandfather Acrisius heard that Perseus was coming, he fled, still afraid of the prophecy. Perseus pursued him, not meaning harm but simply wanting to meet him. They ended up in the city of Larissa, where games were being held. Perseus participated in the discus throw, but a gust of wind caught his discus and carried it off course, striking and killing an old man in the crowd. That man was Acrisius, traveling in disguise. The prophecy had fulfilled itself despite all attempts to avoid it, proving once more that fate could not be escaped. Perseus was stricken with grief and guilt, despite the accident's nature. He refused to claim the throne of Argos, instead trading kingdoms with his cousin, taking the city of Tiryns instead. He and Andromeda lived a long life together, founding the city of Mycenae, and their descendants would include Heracles. When they died, Athena placed them among the stars, where they shine still as constellations, eternal reminders of bravery, love, and the inescapable nature of destiny. The theme of inescapable fate ran through many Greek myths, perhaps none more tragically than the story of Oedipus. King Laius of Thebes received a prophecy that his son would kill him and marry his wife. When Queen Jocasta bore a son, Laius ordered the infant taken to Mount Cithaeron and left to die, his ankles pierced and bound to prevent him from crawling. But the shepherd assigned this task took pity on the baby and gave him instead to a shepherd from Corinth, who brought the child to King Polybus and Queen Merope, who were childless. They raised the boy as their own, naming him Oedipus, which meant swollen foot, because of the damage to his ankles. Oedipus grew up believing Polybus and Merope were his true parents, but when he was a young man, a drunken guest at a feast suggested he was not truly their son. Troubled, Oedipus traveled to Delphi to consult the oracle. The Pythia did not answer his question about his parentage but instead gave him a horrifying prophecy: he would kill his father and marry his mother. Determined to avoid this fate, Oedipus refused to return to Corinth. Instead, he set out toward Thebes, intending to make a new life far from those he thought were his parents. At a place where three roads met, he encountered a small procession. An older man in a chariot demanded that Oedipus move aside, and when Oedipus refused, the men struck him. Oedipus, with the hot temper common to Greek heroes, retaliated, killing the older men and most of his attendants. He did not know that the men he killed was Laius, his true father, and that the first part of the prophecy had just been fulfilled. Oedipus continued to Thebes, where he found the city in crisis. The Sphinx, a monster with the body of a lion, the wings of an eagle, and the head of a woman, had taken up residence on a rock outside the city. She posed a riddle to all who passed, and those who could not answer correctly were devoured. The riddle was this: what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Oedipus, clever and confident, answered correctly: man, who crawls as an infant, walks upright in adulthood, and uses a cane in old age. The Sphinx, defeated, threw herself from her rock and died. The grateful Thebans made Oedipus their king, and he married the widowed queen, Jocasta, not knowing she was his mother. They had 4 children together, Eteocles, Polynices, Antigone, and Ismene, and for years, Thebes prospered under Oedipus's rule. But eventually, a plague fell upon the city. Crops failed, women could not bear children, disease spread through the population. Oedipus sent Creon, Jocasta's brother, to Delphi to ask Apollo what could be done. The oracle responded that the plague would only end when Laius's murderer was found and punished. Oedipus, zealous in his desire to help his people, declared that he would find the murderer and drive him from the city. He consulted the blind prophet Tiresias, who reluctantly revealed that Oedipus himself was the murderer. Oedipus refused to believe this, suspecting a conspiracy between Tiresias and Creon to seize the throne. But gradually, through investigation and the testimony of witnesses, the terrible truth emerged. The shepherd who had been ordered to kill the infant Oedipus was found, and he admitted what he had done. Jocasta, realizing the horror before Oedipus did, begged him to stop searching, but he insisted on knowing the full truth. When at last he understood that he had killed his father at the crossroads, that he had married his mother and fathered children with her, that the prophecy had been fulfilled despite all attempts to avoid it, his anguish was absolute. Jocasta hanged herself in her chambers. Oedipus found her body, and in his grief and horror, he took the pins from her dress and used them to gouge out his own eyes, blinding himself so he would never again have to see the results of his actions. He exiled himself from Thebes, wandering as a blind beggar, led by his daughter Antigone, who remained loyal to him despite everything. The story of Oedipus was a meditation on fate, free will, guilt, and the limits of human knowledge. Oedipus tried to be a good man, to avoid the terrible prophecy, to serve his people well. Yet his very attempts to escape his fate ensured that it came to pass. The Greeks saw in this story a reflection of the human condition. We act with incomplete knowledge, we cannot control the circumstances of our birth or the ultimate consequences of our choices, and yet we bear responsibility for our actions nonetheless. The curse that Oedipus brought upon his family did not end with him. His sons, Eteocles and Polynices, agreed to share the throne of Thebes, alternating years of rule. But when Eteocles' first year ended, he refused to yield power. Polynices, enraged, fled to Argos and gathered an army, recruiting 6 other champions to help him attack Thebes. This became known as the 7 against Thebes, one of the great military campaigns of Greek mythology. The 7 champions each took one of the 7 gates of Thebes. Amphiaraus, the prophet, knew the expedition would fail and that he would die, but went anyway, bound by honor. Capaneus, filled with hubris, boasted that not even Zeus could keep him from taking the city, and was struck down by a thunderbolt as he climbed the walls. Tydeus, savage in battle, was wounded and would have been granted immortality by Athena, but he ate his enemy's brain in his rage, disgusting the goddess, who withheld her gift. One by one, the attackers died or were defeated. Finally, Polynices and Eteocles met in single combat, brother against brother, each determined to kill the other. They fought with terrible ferocity, and both delivered mortal wounds simultaneously. As they lay dying, each still had enough strength to strike one more blow, ensuring that neither would survive. The brothers died locked in mutual hatred, the curse of Oedipus's house claiming another generation. Creon, who had become ruler again after the deaths of Oedipus's sons, decreed that Eteocles, who had defended the city, would be buried with full honors, but Polynices, who had attacked it, would be left unburied, his corpse food for carrion birds and dogs. In Greek culture, to be left unburied was the worst possible fate, condemning the soul to wander eternally, unable to cross the river Styx into the proper afterlife. Antigone, sister of both dead men, refused to accept this injustice. Despite Creon's edict and the threat of death for disobedience, she performed burial rites for Polynices, sprinkling dust over his body and pouring libations. When she was caught, she defended her actions, saying that the unwritten laws of the gods, which demanded that family bury family and that the dead be honored, were more important than any human decree. Creon ordered Antigone sealed alive in a tomb, despite the fact that she was engaged to his own son, Haman. The prophet Tiresias warned Creon that the gods were angry with his actions, that he had disturbed the natural order by leaving a corpse unburied above ground while burying a living person below. Creon eventually relented, but it was too late. When the tomb was opened, Antigone had hanged herself with her veil. Haman, discovering her body, attacked his father in grief and rage, then killed himself. Creon's wife, Eurydice, hearing of her son's death, also took her own life. Creon was left alone, his family destroyed by his own stubborn pride, his power meaningless in the face of such loss. The story of Antigone explored the tension between human law and divine law, between the authority of the state and the obligations of family and faith. It asked which should take precedence when they conflict, and it suggested that sometimes the individual conscience, guided by ancient and unwritten moral principles, must stand against even legitimate authority. These cycles of tragedy and heroism defined much of Greek mythology. Another such cycle centered on the city of Troy, a conflict that began with a beauty contest among goddesses and ended with the destruction of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. It started at the wedding of Peleus, a mortal hero, and Thetis, a sea nymph. All the gods were invited except Eris, the goddess of discord, because her presence always brought chaos and conflict. Offended by the snub, Eris appeared anyway and threw a golden apple into the midst of the celebration. Inscribed on it were the words, "For the fairest." 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each believed herself to be the most beautiful, and none would yield to the others. They brought their dispute to Zeus, but Zeus, wise enough to avoid choosing among his wife, his daughter, and his favorite child, declared that the judgment should be made by Paris, a mortal prince of Troy who was known for his beauty and his ability to make fair judgments. Paris had been born to King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy, but an oracle had prophesied that he would bring about the destruction of his city. To prevent this, he had been left to die as an infant on Mount Ida, but like so many fated children, he was rescued by shepherds and grew up tending flocks, unaware of his royal heritage. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris, each offering him a bribe. Hera promised him power and sovereignty over all of Europe and Asia if he chose her. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in battle, promising to make him the greatest warrior who ever lived. Aphrodite, knowing the desires of men's hearts, promised him the most beautiful woman in the world as his wife. Paris, young and passionate, chose Aphrodite. The moment he awarded her the golden apple, he made enemies of Hera and Athena, who would forever after hate Troy and work toward its destruction. And Aphrodite began to fulfill her promise, though the most beautiful woman in the world was already married. Helen was the daughter of Zeus and Leda, a mortal queen. Zeus had come to Leda in the form of a swan, and from that union, 2 eggs were born. From one came Helen and her brother Polydeuces. From the other came Clytemnestra and Castor. Helen's beauty was so extraordinary that even as a child, she was desired by many. When she came of age, all the greatest heroes and kings of Greece sought her hand in marriage. Helen's earthly father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, feared that choosing one suitor would make enemies of all the others. A clever suitor named Odysseus suggested that all the men swear an oath to defend the marriage of whoever was chosen, to support Helen's husband if anyone ever tried to steal her away. All the suitors agreed and swore the oath. Helen chose Menelaus, who became king of Sparta, and it seemed that she would live a peaceful, prosperous life. But Aphrodite's promise to Paris had yet to be fulfilled. Paris, having been recognized as Priam's son and restored to his position in Troy, traveled to Sparta as a guest of Menelaus. While there, Aphrodite caused Helen to fall desperately in love with Paris. Accounts differ on whether Helen went willingly or was abducted, whether she was enchanted by Aphrodite's power or simply overwhelmed by passion. Either way, while Menelaus was away attending a funeral, Helen left Sparta with Paris, taking much of the palace's treasure with her, and sailed to Troy. When Menelaus discovered what had happened, his rage was terrible. He called upon all the suitors who had sworn the oath to help him retrieve his wife and punish Troy for its violation of guest right, one of the most sacred bonds in Greek culture. Slowly, reluctantly in some cases, the Greek heroes gathered. Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and the most powerful king in Greece, took command of the expedition. Achilles, the greatest warrior alive, came with his myrmidons. Ajax the Great, a mountain of a man, brought his forces. Odysseus, the craftiest of the Greeks, came despite trying to avoid the war by feigning madness. Diomedes, Nestor, Idomeneus, and many others joined the fleet. There was one hero who tried to avoid going to war. Achilles' mother, the sea nymph Thetis, knew a prophecy: if Achilles went to Troy, he would die young but win eternal glory. If he stayed home, he would live a long, peaceful life but be forgotten. Thetis, loving her son, tried to hide him. She sent him to the court of King Lycomedes on the island of Skyros, disguising him as a girl among the king's daughters. But Odysseus, knowing that the Greeks could not win without Achilles, discovered where he was hidden. Odysseus came to Lycomedes' palace disguised as a merchant, displaying fine jewelry and cloth that would appeal to young women, but also including weapons among his wares. The girls examined the jewelry with interest, but Achilles was drawn to the weapons. When Odysseus had a trumpet sounded, mimicking an attack, Achilles instinctively grabbed a spear and shield, revealing himself. His disguise penetrated. Achilles chose glory over long life and joined the expedition, bringing with him his dearest friend and possible lover, Patroclus. The Greek fleet assembled at Aulis, 1,000 ships prepared to sail across the Aegean to Troy. But when they were ready to depart, the winds died completely. No breeze stirred the sails, and the fleet sat becalmed, unable to leave port. The prophet Calchas examined the omens and declared that Artemis was angry, and she would not allow the winds to blow until Agamemnon sacrificed his own daughter Iphigenia to the goddess. The reasons for Artemis's anger varied in different tellings. Some said Agamemnon had killed a deer sacred to the goddess and boasted he was a better hunter than she. Others said the goddess simply wanted to test the Greeks' resolve or punish them for the hubris of thinking they could attack a great city without divine permission. Either way, the demand was clear. Agamemnon faced a terrible choice: abandon the expedition and lose face before all Greece, or kill his own child to appease a goddess. After agonizing deliberation, he chose glory and duty over family. He sent for Iphigenia, telling her mother Clytemnestra that Iphigenia was to be married to Achilles, a great honor. When they arrived at Aulis, Iphigenia learned the truth. Some versions say she went willingly to the altar, choosing to die nobly for the expedition's success. Others say she begged for her life but was held down as the knife descended. In most versions, at the last moment, Artemis took pity on the girl. She replaced Iphigenia with a deer on the altar and spirited the real Iphigenia away to become a priestess in a far-off land. But Agamemnon did not know this, and neither did Clytemnestra, who believed her husband had murdered their daughter. She never forgave him, and her hatred would eventually lead to his death. With Iphigenia's sacrifice, the winds returned, and the Greek fleet sailed for Troy. They landed on the beaches near the city, and the Trojans came out to meet them. For 9 years, the war raged without resolution. The Greeks could not breach Troy's massive walls, built by Poseidon and Apollo in ages past, and the Trojans could not drive the Greeks back into the sea. They met in battle on the plain between the city and the shore, fighting day after day, with heroes dueling while armies clashed around them. Achilles was the greatest of the Greek warriors, nearly invincible in combat. His mother had dipped him in the river Styx as an infant, making his body impervious to harm everywhere except the heel by which she held him. He carved through Trojan ranks like a farmer reaping grain, and even Hector, Troy's greatest champion and Paris's older brother, avoided facing him directly. But in the 10th year of the war, a dispute arose that would change everything. Agamemnon had taken a captive woman named Chryseis as his prize, but her father was a priest of Apollo. The priest begged for his daughter's return, offering rich ransom, but Agamemnon refused. Apollo, angered on behalf of his priest, sent a plague upon the Greek camp. Calchas revealed that the plague would only end if Chryseis was returned, and Agamemnon was finally forced to comply. However, Agamemnon demanded compensation for his lost prize, and he took from Achilles a captive woman named Briseis, whom Achilles had claimed and loved. Achilles, though he could have killed Agamemnon easily, restrained himself at the urging of Athena. But he refused to fight any longer. He withdrew to his tent with his myrmidons, refusing to participate in battle, and he prayed to his mother Thetis to ask Zeus to let the Trojans win so that the Greeks would realize how much they needed him. Zeus agreed to honor Thetis's request, though Hera, who supported the Greeks, was furious. The next battles went badly for the Greeks. Without Achilles, their greatest warrior, they were pushed back toward their ships. Hector led the Trojan forces with devastating effectiveness, cutting through the Greek ranks, setting fire to their ships, threatening to destroy the entire expedition. The Greeks sent embassies to Achilles, offering him magnificent gifts, promising to return Briseis, begging him to rejoin the fight. But Achilles, consumed by his wounded pride and rage at the dishonor he had suffered, refused. He said he would sail home, that glory was not worth the disrespect he had endured, that a long life in obscurity was better than dying for men who did not value him. Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, watched the Greeks being slaughtered and could not bear it any longer. He begged Achilles to let him borrow his armor and lead the Myrmidons into battle, even if Achilles himself would not fight. Achilles, moved by his friend's plea and perhaps feeling some guilt at his stubbornness, agreed. He dressed Patroclus in his own armor, making him appear to be Achilles himself, and warned him only to drive the Trojans back from the ships, not to pursue them to the city walls. Patroclus led the Myrmidons into battle, and the Trojans, seeing what they thought was Achilles returned, fell back in terror. Patroclus fought brilliantly, driving the Trojans across the plain, killing many of their warriors. But he became caught up in the momentum of victory and forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the Trojans all the way to the walls of the city, where Apollo himself intervened. The god struck Patroclus, dazing him, and the armor fell from his body. Hector, realizing that this was not actually Achilles but some other warrior wearing his gear, seized the opportunity. He drove his spear through Patroclus's abdomen, delivering a fatal wound. As Patroclus lay dying, Hector stripped Achilles' armor from his body and claimed it as his own prize. When news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, his grief was so terrible that his cry could be heard across the entire battlefield. He tore his hair and covered himself with ash, refusing to eat or drink, lost in anguish so profound that it seemed it might kill him. Thetis came to comfort her son, and he told her that he would have revenge on Hector, even though she warned him that his own death would follow soon after Hector's. Achilles no longer cared about living. With Patroclus gone, life held no meaning for him. He wanted only vengeance. Thetis went to Hephaestus and begged him to forge new armor for her son, since Hector had taken the old. The smith god, who owed Thetis a debt of gratitude for rescuing him when Hera threw him from Olympus, worked through the night creating the most magnificent armor ever made. The shield alone was a masterwork, decorated with scenes of the entire world, cities at peace and war, farmers harvesting fields, shepherds tending flocks, dancers celebrating, the ocean encircling everything. He made a breastplate that would turn any weapon, a helmet that shone like the sun, greaves that fitted perfectly. When Thetis brought this armor to Achilles, he put it on and returned to battle, transformed from a grief-stricken man into something more like a force of nature, an embodiment of rage and loss. Achilles' return to the battlefield was apocalyptic. He killed every Trojan warrior he encountered, showing no mercy, taking no prisoners. He fought the river god Scamander, filling the river with so many corpses that the waters rose in protest, trying to drown him, until Hephaestus sent flames to drive the river back. He pursued the Trojans back to their city gates, and there, finally, he faced Hector. Hector had known this moment was coming. His wife Andromache had begged him not to fight, to stay within the walls where he would be safe, reminding him of their young son Astyanax who would be left fatherless. His parents had pleaded with him to come inside the gates. But Hector, as the greatest defender of Troy, could not hide while his people suffered. He had caused Patroclus's death, and he knew Achilles would demand payment. When Achilles appeared before the Scaean gates, Hector's courage momentarily failed. He ran, and Achilles chased him 3 times around the walls of Troy while both armies watched, unable to intervene. Finally, Athena appeared to Hector in the guise of his brother Deiphobus, saying she would fight alongside him. Encouraged, Hector turned to face Achilles. They fought, and Hector quickly realized that Athena had deceived him, that he was alone against an enemy who was beyond any mortal warrior. Achilles' spear found the one vulnerable spot in Hector's armor, the gap at the collarbone, and drove through his throat. As Hector lay dying, he begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. But Achilles, still consumed by grief and rage, refused. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust back to the Greek camp, desecrating the corpse in the worst way imaginable. For days, he continued this abuse, dragging Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb each morning, unable to let go of his anger. The gods, disturbed by this disrespect for the dead, finally intervened. Zeus sent Thetis to Achilles to tell him that he must accept a ransom and return Hector's body. That same night, King Priam, guided by Hermes, came alone to Achilles' tent. The old king knelt before the young warrior who had killed so many of his sons, kissed the hands that had slain Hector, and begged for his son's body. Priam's courage and grief finally penetrated Achilles' rage. He saw in Priam an image of his own father, whom he would never see again, and he remembered his own mortality, his own coming death. He wept with Priam, enemy with enemy, both men grieving for what they had lost and what they would lose. Achilles agreed to return Hector's body and granted the Trojans a 12-day truce for the funeral rites. The Iliad, Homer's great epic, ends with Hector's funeral, a moment of profound humanity amid the brutal conflict. But the war itself was far from over, and Achilles' own death was approaching. Paris, guided by Apollo, shot an arrow that struck Achilles in his one vulnerable spot, his heel. Some versions say Apollo guided the arrow himself. Others say Paris was simply lucky, or perhaps that the gods felt Achilles had lived long enough. Either way, the greatest warrior of Greece died not in glorious single combat but from an arrow wound, brought down by a man considered a lesser fighter, an archer rather than a warrior. The Greeks held elaborate funeral games for Achilles, honoring him as he had honored Patroclus. His armor was awarded to Odysseus after a contest, which enraged Ajax the Great, who believed he deserved the honor. Ajax, driven mad by this slight, attacked a flock of sheep, believing them to be the Greek commanders who had denied him. When sanity returned and he realized what he had done, he was so shamed that he fell upon his own sword, ending his life. With both Achilles and Ajax dead, the Greeks seemed to be losing their greatest heroes one by one. The war had dragged on for 10 years, and neither side could achieve victory. Troy's walls remained unbreached, and the Trojans could not drive the Greeks away. It seemed the conflict might last forever, an eternal stalemate that would grind both sides down to nothing. But Odysseus, the craftiest of the Greeks, conceived a plan. The Greeks would build a massive wooden horse, hollow inside, and hide their best warriors within it. The rest of the Greek army would burn their camps and sail away, appearing to have given up and gone home, leaving only the horse behind as an offering to Athena. The Greeks constructed the horse, and volunteers climbed inside, including Odysseus himself, Menelaus, Diomedes, and others. The rest of the fleet sailed to a nearby island where they would wait, hidden from view. When the Trojans emerged from their city the next morning and saw the Greek camp deserted and the giant horse standing alone on the beach, they were astonished and suspicious. Some Trojans wanted to burn the horse immediately. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, famously warned them, saying, "I fear the Greeks, even when bearing gifts." He threw a spear at the horse's side, and if the Trojans had listened to him, they might have discovered the hidden warriors. But Athena and Poseidon, still angry at Troy, sent two great serpents from the sea that wrapped around Laocoon and his sons, crushing them to death. The Trojans took this as a sign that the gods wanted them to accept the horse. Sinon, a Greek warrior who had stayed behind as part of the plan, told the Trojans that he had been abandoned by his comrades and that the horse was indeed an offering to Athena, built so large that the Trojans could not bring it into the city, because if they did, Troy would become unconquerable. This reverse psychology worked perfectly. The Trojans, wanting to claim the blessing for themselves, tore down a section of their wall and dragged the horse inside the city. They celebrated all night, drinking and feasting, believing the war was finally over. When the city had fallen into drunken sleep, the Greek warriors emerged from the horse. They opened the gates of Troy, and the Greek army, which had sailed back under cover of darkness, poured into the city. What followed was a massacre. The Greeks, after 10 years of war, after losing so many comrades, after suffering and fighting far from home, showed little mercy. They killed the men of Troy, enslaved the women and children, and set fire to the great city. Priam was murdered at an altar, seeking sanctuary that the Greeks refused to honor. Hector's son Astyanax was thrown from the walls, the Greeks reasoning that they could not leave alive any who might grow up to avenge Troy. Hector's wife Andromache was taken as a slave. Cassandra, Priam's daughter who had been cursed by Apollo with the gift of prophecy that no one would believe, was claimed by Agamemnon despite her attempts to seek sanctuary at Athena's altar. This sacrilege would later contribute to Agamemnon's downfall. Helen was recovered by Menelaus, who initially intended to kill her for causing the war, but when he saw her face again, his anger melted away, and he took her back as his wife. Paris had already been killed in the fighting, and Helen returned to Sparta with Menelaus, where they would live together, their relationship forever marked by the destruction her beauty had caused, whether willingly or not. The few Trojans who survived the massacre scattered. Aeneas, a Trojan prince and son of Aphrodite, escaped carrying his father Anchises on his back and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand. He took with him the sacred images of Troy's gods, and he would eventually sail west to Italy, where his descendants would found Rome, giving Troy a kind of ultimate victory as Rome would one day conquer Greece. But for the Greeks, victory in Troy did not mean safe return home. The gods were angered by how the Greeks had disrespected the sacred places during the sack of Troy, particularly Ajax the Lesser's assault on Cassandra in Athena's temple. The goddess turned against those who had fought for her, and she convinced Poseidon to help her punish the returning Greeks. The journey home, which should have taken weeks, would take some heroes' years. Menelaus and Helen were blown off course to Egypt and wandered for 7 years before reaching Sparta. Odysseus, whose cunning had won the war, would wander for 10 years, encountering monsters, sorceresses, and gods, losing all his men before finally returning alone to Ithaca, his island kingdom. His journey would become another epic, the Odyssey, a story of perseverance, identity, and the difficulty of returning home after war has changed you. Odysseus's voyage took him first to the land of the Lotus Eaters, where his men consumed a flower that made them forget their homes and want to stay forever in peaceful forgetfulness. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force. Then they came to the island of the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants who were sons of Poseidon. Odysseus and some of his men were trapped in the cave of Polyphemus, who ate several of them. Odysseus got the Cyclops drunk on wine, then drove a heated stake through his single eye, blinding him. When Polyphemus asked who had hurt him, Odysseus, having told the Cyclops his name was Nobody, made the giant cry out that nobody was attacking him, so the other Cyclopes did not come to help. But as Odysseus sailed away, his pride overcame his caution, and he shouted his real name to the blinded Cyclops. Polyphemus called upon his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, asking that if he must reach home, let it be late, alone, and to find trouble in his house. Poseidon granted this prayer, ensuring that Odysseus's journey would be long and painful. Odysseus visited Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who gave him a bag containing all the winds except the gentle west wind that would carry him home. But when they were almost in sight of Ithaca, Odysseus's men, thinking the bag contained treasure, opened it. All the winds escaped, blowing the ships back across the sea. They came to the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed all but one of Odysseus's 12 ships. With his remaining ship and crew, Odysseus reached the island of Aeaea, home of Circe, a goddess and sorceress. She turned half his men into pigs with her magic. Odysseus, protected by a herb given him by Hermes, resisted her magic and forced her to restore his men. He stayed with Circe for a year, some say as her lover, and she advised him that to find his way home, he must first journey to the underworld and consult the prophet Tiresias. Odysseus sailed to the edge of the world and performed rituals to summon the dead. The ghosts came to drink the blood he offered, and among them was Tiresias, who warned Odysseus about the dangers ahead, particularly the need to avoid harming the cattle of Helios, the sun god. Odysseus also met the ghost of his mother, who had died of grief waiting for his return, and the ghost of Agamemnon, who warned him to be careful when returning home, for Agamemnon himself had been murdered by his wife upon his return from Troy. Clytemnestra, still bitter about Iphigenia's sacrifice, had taken a lover, Aegisthus, while Agamemnon was at war. When Agamemnon returned, triumphant and bringing Cassandra as his concubine, Clytemnestra welcomed him home with apparent joy. She prepared a bath for him, and when he emerged, she threw a net over him and, with Aegisthus's help, hacked him to death with an axe. She killed Cassandra as well, eliminating any witness to her crime. This murder would set in motion another cycle of vengeance when Agamemnon's children, Orestes and Electra, eventually killed Clytemnestra and Aegisthus to avenge their father, only to be pursued by the Furies for the crime of matricide. Forewarned by Agamemnon's ghost, Odysseus continued his journey. He and his crew sailed past the Sirens, creatures with women's heads and birds' bodies whose song was so beautiful that any sailor who heard it would steer toward them and crash upon the rocks. Odysseus wanted to hear their song, so he had his men plug their ears with wax and tie him to the mast, ordering them not to release him no matter how he begged. As they sailed past, Odysseus heard the Sirens' song, which promised knowledge of everything that had happened and would happen, and he strained against his bonds, desperate to go to them, but his men held course and they passed safely. Next came the narrow strait between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla was a six-headed monster who lived in a cliff, reaching down to snatch sailors from passing ships. Charybdis was a whirlpool that would swallow entire vessels. Odysseus chose to sail closer to Scylla, sacrificing 6 men rather than risk losing the entire ship to Charybdis. It was a brutal calculation, the kind of impossible choice that leaders must sometimes make. Finally, they reached the island of Thrinacia, where Helios's sacred cattle grazed. Odysseus warned his men not to touch the cattle, but they were delayed on the island by storms, and their supplies ran out. While Odysseus was praying to the gods, his hungry men slaughtered and ate some of the cattle. Helios, enraged, demanded that Zeus punish them. When they set sail again, Zeus sent a thunderbolt that destroyed the ship and killed all of Odysseus's crew. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage, drifting alone until he washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso. She fell in love with him and kept him there for 7 years, offering him immortality if he would stay with her forever. But Odysseus, despite the temptation of eternal life and the love of a beautiful goddess, longed only to return home to his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus. Finally, at Zeus's command, Calypso released him. Odysseus built a raft and sailed toward home, but Poseidon, still angry, sent a storm that destroyed the raft. Odysseus nearly drowned before washing ashore, naked and exhausted, on the island of the Phaeacians. There, the princess Nausicaa found him and brought him to her father's palace. The Phaeacians, a people beloved by the gods, listened to Odysseus's story and gave him passage home on one of their magical ships that could sail faster than thought. Odysseus finally reached Ithaca after 20 years away, 10 fighting at Troy, 10 trying to return. But even now, his trials were not over. In his absence, more than 100 suitors had invaded his palace, consuming his wealth, harassing his wife, and trying to force Penelope to choose one of them to marry. They assumed Odysseus was dead, and they wanted his throne and his wife. Penelope had remained faithful, using cleverness to delay choosing a suitor. She said she would choose once she finished weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's father Laertes. Each day she wove, and each night she secretly unraveled what she had done, making the task never-ending. But eventually, a servant betrayed her, and the suitors demanded she make her choice. Odysseus, with Athena's help, disguised himself as an old beggar and entered his own palace. Only his old dog Argos recognized him, the dog who had waited 20 years for his master's return. Argos wagged his tail once and then died, his vigil finally complete. Odysseus observed the suitors, seeing how they abused his household, and he planned his revenge. Penelope, still clever, devised a final test. She announced that she would marry whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe handles set in a line. One by one, the suitors tried and failed. The bow, which Odysseus had left behind when he went to war, was too strong for any of them. Finally, the old beggar asked to try. The suitors mocked him, but Penelope allowed it. Odysseus picked up his bow, strung it effortlessly, and shot an arrow perfectly through all 12 axes. Then he revealed his true identity and, with the help of his son Telemachus and his loyal swineherd and cowherd, he turned the bow on the suitors. Athena sealed the doors so none could escape, and Odysseus shot them down one by one. Those who tried to fight, he killed with his sword and spear. The palace floors ran red with blood as Odysseus took terrible vengeance for the years of disrespect and the presumption that his household and wife were theirs to claim. When all the suitors lay dead, Odysseus finally revealed himself to Penelope. But she, cautious and clever still, devised one last test to ensure this was truly her husband and not some trick of the gods. She told a servant to move their bed out of the bedroom. Odysseus objected, explaining that this was impossible because he had built their bed himself, carving one of its posts from a living olive tree that grew in the ground, making the bed immovable. Only Odysseus would know this detail, and when he spoke it, Penelope knew for certain that her husband had returned. They embraced after 20 years apart, and Odysseus was finally home. The Odyssey ends with Odysseus reunited with his wife and son, his throne reclaimed, his enemies defeated. But even this was not entirely the end. The families of the slain suitors wanted vengeance, and fighting threatened to break out. Athena, speaking with Zeus's authority, imposed peace, declaring that enough blood had been shed, that the cycle of vengeance must end. Odysseus would rule Ithaca for many more years, a wise king whose journeys had taught him patience, humility, and the value of home. The tale of Odysseus showed a different kind of heroism from the raw warrior glory of Achilles. Odysseus survived through cleverness, adaptability, and perseverance. He was not the strongest or the fastest, But he was the most resourceful, the one who could think his way through problems, who could endure suffering, who never stopped trying to return home no matter how long it took or how impossible it seemed. This theme of the journey, of transformation through trial, appeared throughout Greek mythology in different forms. Another such journey was that of Jason and the Argonauts, a generation before the Trojan War, when Jason sought the Golden Fleece to reclaim his rightful throne. Jason was the son of Ezon, who had been king of Iolcus until his half-brother Peleus seized the throne. Peleus would have killed the infant Jason, but he was smuggled away and raised by Chiron the centaur, the wise tutor who had trained so many heroes. When Jason came of age, he returned to Iolcus to claim his birthright. As Jason approached the city, he helped an old woman cross a river, losing one of his sandals in the process. The old woman was Hera in disguise, testing him, and she became his patron because of his kindness. When Jason arrived at Peleus's court wearing only one sandal, the usurper king was disturbed, for an oracle had warned him to beware of a man wearing one sandal. Peleus did not want to kill Jason outright, fearing divine retribution and public opinion, so he devised a task that seemed impossible. He told Jason that he would surrender the throne if Jason brought him the Golden Fleece, a sacred ram's hide that hung in a grove in distant Colchis, at the edge of the known world, guarded by a sleepless dragon and King Aeetes, son of Helios. Jason accepted the challenge and commissioned the building of a great ship, the Argo, which would be the largest and finest vessel ever constructed. The ship's bow was made from wood taken from the sacred oak of Dodona, Zeus's oracle, and it could speak prophecy. Jason sent word throughout Greece, calling for heroes to join his quest, and they came, the greatest warriors and adventurers of their generation. They called themselves the Argonauts, and their names read like a catalogue of legend: Heracles, the strongest man alive; Castor and Polydeuces, the twin sons of Zeus; Orpheus, whose music could charm stones and tame wild beasts; Atalanta, the swift huntress who would accept no man as her equal; Peleus, who would father Achilles; Meleager, Theseus, and dozens more, each bringing their own skills and stories. The voyage itself was an odyssey of marvels and dangers. They stopped at Lemnos, an island inhabited only by women who had killed all their men for taking foreign wives. The Lemnian women welcomed the Argonauts, and many of the heroes took lovers there, Jason himself fathering children with Queen Hypsipyle. They encountered the Gyges, six-armed giants who attacked them in the night. They lost Heracles when he went searching for his beloved companion Hylas, who was pulled into a spring by enamored water nymphs and never seen again. Heracles refused to leave without Hylas, so the Argo sailed on without the greatest of heroes. They came to the land of the Bebryces, whose king Amycus forced all strangers to box with him until death. Polydeuces, patron of boxers, defeated and killed the brutal king. They traveled through the Bosporus, passing by the land of Phineus, a prophet whom Zeus had blinded and cursed with harpies, foul creatures with women's faces and birds' bodies who would swoop down and steal or befoul his food whenever he tried to eat. The Argonauts drove away the harpies, and Phineus, in gratitude, told them how to navigate the clashing rocks, the Symplegades, which smashed together to destroy any ship trying to pass between them. Phineus advised them to release a dove and watch whether it made it through. If the dove survived, they should row with all their strength immediately after. They did as he suggested, and the dove flew through with only its tail feathers caught between the rocks. The Argonauts rowed with desperate speed, and Athena herself gave them an extra push. The Argo passed through with only its stern ornament damaged, and after that, the Symplegades became fixed in place, never to move again. Finally, the Argonauts reached Colchis, the kingdom at the edge of the world where the sun rose each morning. Jason presented himself to King Aeetes and requested the Golden Fleece. Aeetes had no intention of giving it up, but he could not simply refuse a guest's request without violating sacred hospitality. So he set Jason a task that he believed would kill him. Jason must yoke 2 bronze bulls that breathed fire, plow a field with them, and sow the furrows with dragon's teeth. From these teeth would spring armed warriors, and Jason would have to defeat them all. Jason despaired, knowing he could not accomplish these tasks alone. But Hera and Aphrodite took pity on him. They caused Aeetes' daughter Medea, a priestess of Hecate skilled in witchcraft and potions, to fall desperately in love with Jason. Medea was torn between loyalty to her father and this overwhelming passion for a foreign stranger. Love won. She went to Jason in secret and offered to help him if he would swear to marry her and take her with him when he left. Jason swore a solemn oath, and Medea gave him a magical ointment that would protect him from the bull's fire and make him invulnerable for one day. She told him that when the warriors sprang from the dragon's teeth, he should throw a stone among them, and they would turn on each other, thinking one of their own number had struck them. Jason did exactly as Medea instructed. He yoked the bronze bulls, though they breathed flames hot enough to melt bronze. He plowed the field and sowed the dragon's teeth. When armed men erupted from the soil, he threw a stone among them, and they fell upon each other, killing themselves while Jason finished off the survivors. Aeetes, realizing that Jason must have had help, refused to honor their agreement. He planned to burn the Argo and kill all the Argonauts in their sleep. But Medea learned of her father's treachery, and that night she led Jason to the grove where the golden fleece hung. The dragon that guarded it never slept, and its teeth dripped with venom. Medea sang to it, used her magic to enchant it, and the great serpent finally closed its eyes. Jason snatched the golden fleece from the oak tree where it gleamed in the moonlight, and together, he and Medea ran for the ship. They fled across the sea with Aeetes and his fleet in pursuit. In the most horrible part of the story, Medea had brought along her younger brother Apsyrtus, and when it seemed they would be caught, she killed the boy and threw pieces of his body into the sea. Aeetes stopped to gather his son's remains for proper burial, and the Argo escaped. This act showed the darkness in Medea, the terrible things she was capable of when driven by passion or necessity. She had betrayed her father, her people, her family, all for Jason, and she would never be able to return home. The return journey took the Argonauts through strange waters and more adventures. They had to be purified by Circe for the murder of Apsyrtus. They passed the island of the Sirens, but Orpheus played his lyre so beautifully that his music drowned out their deadly song. They encountered the bronze giant Talos, who guarded Crete, but Medea used her magic to destroy him. Finally, they returned to Iolcus with the golden fleece. But Peleus refused to honor his promise, claiming that the quest's success was due to sorcery, not Jason's heroism. Medea, enraged on her husband's behalf, convinced Peleus's own daughters that she could make their father young again if they cut him into pieces and boiled him in a cauldron with magic herbs. She demonstrated by doing this with an old ram, which emerged alive and youthful. The daughters, trusting her, killed and dismembered their father, but of course, Medea did not actually restore him. Peleus remained dead, and Jason and Medea had to flee Iolcus, now murderers as well as heroes. They settled in Corinth, where they lived for years, and Medea bore Jason several children. But eventually, Jason's eyes wandered. He arranged to marry Glauce, the daughter of Corinth's king, seeing an opportunity to secure his position through a politically advantageous marriage. He planned to set Medea aside, breaking the oath he had sworn when she saved his life in Colchis. Medea's rage was absolute. She had given up everything for Jason, her family, her homeland, her innocence. She had committed terrible crimes to help him succeed. And now he would discard her for a younger, politically useful bride. She prepared a wedding gift for Glauce, a beautiful poison dress and crown. When the princess put them on, they burst into flames that could not be extinguished, killing her and her father who tried to save her. But Medea's vengeance went further. She killed her own children, the sons she had borne to Jason, because she knew this would hurt him more than anything else. Some versions say she did this to prevent Jason's family from killing the children in revenge for Glauce's death. Others say she simply wanted Jason to suffer as she suffered, to know what it meant to lose everything. Jason returned home to find his children dead, his new bride burned, and Medea escaping in a chariot drawn by dragons, sent by her grandfather Helios. Jason's end was pathetic. He grew old alone, his glory faded, wandering without purpose. One day, he sat down to rest in the shade of the Argo, which had been hauled ashore and left to decay. A piece of the ship's stern broke off and fell on his head, killing him. The man who had led the greatest expedition of his age, who had won the Golden Fleece, died forgotten and alone, crushed by a remnant of his past glory. The story of Jason and Medea was a meditation on the costs of heroism, on betrayal and revenge, on what happens when divine-touched passion meets mortal fickleness. Medea was both victim and monster, a woman who gave everything for love and was betrayed, who committed unspeakable acts both in service of that love and in response to its loss. The Greeks saw in her something terrifying but true, that love and hate are adjacent passions, that the depth of one's devotion can be matched by the depth of one's fury, that those who help us can also destroy us if we betray them. Another hero whose story explored the boundaries of human ambition was Bellerophon, who caught and tamed the winged horse Pegasus, who had sprung from Medusa's blood when Perseus killed her. Bellerophon was sent by a jealous king to kill the Chimera, a monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail, which breathed fire and terrorized the land. Riding Pegasus, Bellerophon could attack the Chimera from above, avoiding its flames and eventually killing it. Flush with this victory and others that followed, Bellerophon grew proud. He decided that since he had accomplished feats worthy of the gods, he should join them on Olympus. He tried to ride Pegasus up to the home of the gods, but Zeus, offended by his presumption, sent a gadfly that stung Pegasus. The horse bucked, and Bellerophon fell back to earth. He survived the fall but was crippled and blinded, spending the rest of his life wandering alone, shunned by both gods and men, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris, of reaching beyond one's proper place. Hubris, excessive pride that led one to challenge or disrespect the gods, was perhaps the most dangerous quality a person could possess in Greek mythology. The gods were powerful but not omnipotent, wise but not infallible, and they were jealous of their honors and prerogatives. To claim equality with them, to boast that one was better than they at anything, was to invite disaster. Arachne was a weaver of extraordinary skill who boasted that she was better than Athena herself. Athena came to her in the guise of an old woman and warned her to show proper humility, but Arachne refused. Athena revealed herself and challenged Arachne to a contest. Both wove magnificent tapestries. Athena's depicted the gods in all their glory and showed mortals who had challenged the gods being punished. Arachne showed the gods' misdeeds, their affairs with mortals, their deceptions and abuses. Her work was flawless, perhaps even more perfect than Athena's, but the subject matter was disrespectful. Athena, enraged, struck Arachne and destroyed her tapestry. Arachne, despairing, hanged herself. Athena transformed her into a spider, condemning her to weave forever, her skill preserved but her humanity lost. Niobe, queen of Thebes, boasted that she was greater than Leto because she had 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, while Leto had only 2, Apollo and Artemis. She even suggested that worship should be paid to her rather than to the goddess. Apollo and Artemis, defending their mother's honor, descended upon Thebes. Apollo shot all 7 of Niobe's sons, killing them with his unerring arrows. Artemis shot all 7 daughters. Niobe's husband killed himself in grief, and Niobe wept until she turned to stone, a rock on a mountainside from which water eternally flows like tears. These stories of punishment for hubris served as reminders of humanity's place in the cosmic order. The gods were not necessarily moral exemplars, they were jealous, petty, and often cruel, but they were powerful, and respect must be paid. To be human was to live within limits, to acknowledge that there were powers greater than oneself, that some boundaries were not meant to be crossed. Yet the Greeks also celebrated heroes who pushed at these boundaries, who dared greatly even knowing the risks. Theseus, the great hero of Athens, embodied this tension. His exploits rivaled those of Heracles, and he was credited with unifying Attica under Athens' rule, establishing the democracy that would become that city's pride. Theseus's birth was itself unusual. His mother Aethra was visited in a single night by both Aegeus, king of Athens, and Poseidon. Thus Theseus was both mortal and divine, son of a king and son of a god. Aegeus, before returning to Athens, left a sword and sandals under a great rock, telling Aethra that when their son was strong enough to lift the rock, he should take these tokens and come to Athens to claim his birthright. When Theseus came of age, he lifted the rock easily and took the sword and sandals. Rather than sailing directly to Athens, the safe route, he chose to travel by land, seeking adventure and proving himself. Along the way, he encountered various bandits and monsters, dispatching each with cleverness and strength. He killed Periphetes, who clubbed travelers to death, taking the man's bronze club as his own weapon. He threw Cenes, who would tie victims between bent pine trees and tear them apart, into the same contraption. He killed the Crommyonian sow, a monstrous pig. He threw Siren, who forced travelers to wash his feet before kicking them off a cliff, from that same cliff. He killed Circean in a wrestling match, and most famously, he dealt with Procrustes, who offered travelers a bed and then either stretched them or cut off their limbs to make them fit it, by doing the same to him. When Theseus finally arrived in Athens, he found his father married to Medea, who had fled there after her revenge on Jason. Medea, recognizing Theseus through her magic and fearing he would supplant her own son in Aegeus's affections, convinced the king that this stranger was a threat and should be poisoned. But when Theseus drew his sword at a feast, Aegeus recognized the weapon he had left under the rock and realized this was his son. He knocked the poisoned cup from Theseus's hand, and Medea fled once more. Shortly after Theseus arrived in Athens, the time came for the city to send its tribute to Crete. Years earlier, Athens had lost a war with King Minos of Crete, and as punishment, Athens had to send 7 young men and 7 young women every 9 years to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, a monster with a man's body and a bull's head that lived in the labyrinth, an impossible maze beneath Minos's palace at Knossos. The Minotaur had been born from an offense against the gods. Minos had prayed to Poseidon for a sign to confirm his right to rule, and the god sent a magnificent white bull from the sea, which Minos was supposed to sacrifice in return. But Minos, coveting the beautiful animal, kept it and sacrificed another bull instead. Poseidon, enraged at this disrespect, caused Minos's wife Pasiphae to fall in unnatural lust with the bull. With the help of Daedalus, a master craftsman, Pasiphae had a hollow wooden cow built in which she could hide and mate with the bull. From this union, the Minotaur was born, a creature so monstrous that Minos had Daedalus build the labyrinth to contain it. Theseus volunteered to be one of the 14 young Athenians sent to Crete, intending to kill the Minotaur and end the tribute forever. Aegeus made him promise that if he succeeded, he would change the ship's black sails to white on the return journey, so Aegeus would know from afar that his son lived. Theseus sailed to Crete, and there he met Ariadne, daughter of Minos and Pasiphae. She fell in love with him at first sight and went to Daedalus to ask how Theseus might escape the labyrinth after killing the Minotaur. Daedalus gave her a ball of thread, and Ariadne brought it to Theseus, telling him to tie one end at the entrance and unwind it as he went deeper into the maze. After killing the Minotaur, he could follow the thread back out. Theseus entered the labyrinth with the thread end, after wandering through darkness and impossible passages, found the Minotaur in the center. They fought, man against monster, and Theseus prevailed, strangling the creature or beating it to death with his bare hands depending on the version. He followed Ariadne's thread back out, freed the other Athenian youths, and fled with Ariadne toward Athens. But on the journey home, Theseus stopped at the island of Naxos, and there he abandoned Ariadne while she slept on the beach. Why he did this remains unclear. Some sources say he fell out of love with her. Others say Athena appeared in a dream and commanded him to leave her because she was destined for another. Still others suggest he was simply callous, having gotten what he needed from her and seeing no reason to keep promises made under duress. Ariadne woke to find herself alone, betrayed by the men she had saved, and she wept on that shore until Dionysus found her. The god fell in love with her and made her his wife, eventually granting her immortality, so her story at least ended better than many such abandoned heroines. But Theseus's story took a darker turn. In his excitement or grief or distraction, he forgot to change the ship's sails from black to white. Aegeus, watching from a cliff as he had every day since his son departed, saw the black sails approaching and believed Theseus was dead. In his despair, he threw himself from the cliff into the sea, which was ever after called the Aegean in his memory. Theseus returned victorious only to find he had caused his father's death through carelessness, becoming king through his own tragic error. Theseus went on to have many more adventures. He participated in the Caledonian boar hunt, joined the Argonauts briefly, warred with the Amazons and married their queen Hippolyta, and fathered a son named Hippolytus. He descended to the underworld with his friend Pirithous, who foolishly wanted to abduct Persephone and make her his wife. Hades, pretending to be hospitable, invited them to sit and feast, but when they sat on the chairs of forgetfulness, they became stuck, unable to remember who they were or why they had come. Heracles eventually rescued Theseus during his own journey to capture Cerberus, but Pirithous remained trapped forever, punished for his presumption. Theseus's later years were marked by poor choices and declining fortune. His wife Hippolyta died, and he married Phaedra, sister of Ariadne. Phaedra fell in love with Hippolytus, Theseus's son by Hippolyta, but Hippolytus, devoted to Artemis and sworn to chastity, rejected her advances. Phaedra, humiliated and enraged, hanged herself but left a note accusing Hippolytus of assaulting her. Theseus, believing the lie, called upon Poseidon to punish his son. The god sent a bull from the sea that frightened Hippolytus's horses, and he was dragged to death in his chariot. Too late, Theseus learned the truth, that his son had been innocent, that he had killed him for nothing. Theseus ended his days in exile, pushed from Athens by political rivals, dying alone on a small island when he was thrown from a cliff, whether by accident, suicide, or murder remains unclear. The great hero who had unified Athens, who had slain the Minotaur, who had performed labors to rival Heracles, died far from the city he loved, forgotten or rejected by the people he had served. These patterns appeared again and again in Greek mythology. Heroism followed by hubris, triumph followed by tragedy, the wheel of fortune always turning. The Greeks understood that nothing lasts forever, that glory is fleeting, that even the mightiest heroes are subject to fate and time. Their myths did not offer simple moral lessons or happy endings. Instead, they presented a complex view of existence where virtue was not always rewarded, where the gods were not always just, where trying your best was no guarantee of success, and yet where the struggle itself had meaning, where glory and honor and love and courage mattered even when they led to suffering. The underworld, realm of Hades, loomed over all these stories as the final destination. Death was not an end but a transition to a shadowy existence in the land below. Most souls, upon death, would be ferried across the river Styx by Charon, who demanded payment, a coin placed in the corpse's mouth for passage. Those who were not properly buried or could not pay were doomed to wander the shores of the Styx for 100 years before being allowed to cross. Once across, souls would be judged by 3 judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, all of whom had been wise kings in life. Based on this judgment, souls went to different regions. The truly wicked went to Tartarus, where they suffered eternal torments custom designed for their crimes. Tantalus, who had killed his son and served him as food to test whether the gods could tell, stood forever in a pool beneath fruit trees, but whenever he bent to drink, the water receded, and whenever he reached for fruit, the branches pulled away. Sisyphus, who had cheated death itself and betrayed divine secrets, was condemned to push a boulder up a hill, only to watch it roll back down just before reaching the top, repeating this futile task forever. Most souls, neither particularly virtuous nor particularly wicked, went to the asphodel meadows, a gray, shadowy place where they existed as faint echoes of their living selves, without joy or pain, consciousness but not quite life, memory but not quite experience. They drifted like dreams, remembering their living days but unable to fully participate in existence. The truly virtuous, the heroes and the blessed, went to Elysium or the Isles of the Blessed, paradise at the edges of the underworld. There, the weather was always perfect, food and wine flowed abundantly, and the soul could enjoy eternal peace and happiness. Some souls, having lived 3 virtuous lives and reached Elysium 3 times, could choose to be reincarnated, trying again for a 4th perfect existence. The queen of this realm was Persephone, whose story was central to Greek understanding of the seasons and the cycle of life and death. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest, and she was so beautiful that Hades, lord of the underworld, fell in love with her. With Zeus's permission but without Demeter's knowledge, Hades abducted Persephone while she was gathering flowers in a meadow. The earth opened, and Hades drove his chariot up from below, seized her, and carried her down to his kingdom before she could even cry out. Demeter, discovering her daughter missing, searched the earth for her, neglecting her duties as goddess of harvest. Crops failed, plants withered, and the earth became barren. Humans began to starve, and their sacrifices to the gods ceased. Zeus, realizing that if humanity perished there would be no one to worship the gods, sent Hermes to negotiate with Hades for Persephone's return. Hades agreed to release her, but he had tricked Persephone into eating 6 pomegranate seeds while in the underworld. Ancient law decreed that anyone who ate food in the realm of the dead must remain there. A compromise was reached. Persephone would spend 6 months of each year in the underworld with Hades and 6 months on earth with Demeter. During the months Persephone was below, Demeter grieved and the earth was barren, autumn and winter. When Persephone returned, Demeter rejoiced and the earth bloomed, spring and summer. This myth explained not just the seasons but the fundamental nature of existence. Life and death are bound together, each necessary for the other. The seed must be buried in darkness to sprout. Death feeds life, and life always moves toward death. Joy and sorrow alternate like the seasons. Nothing is permanent except change itself. This understanding permeated Greek culture and mythology. The gods themselves, though immortal, were not unchanging or perfect. They loved, suffered, made mistakes, learned, evolved. Zeus, the king of gods, was powerful but not omnipotent. He had to negotiate, compromise, sometimes yield to fate or to the collective will of the other gods. Hera could make his life miserable with her jealousy. Prometheus could trick him. The fates themselves, Clotho who spun the thread of life, Lachesis who measured it, and Atropos who cut it, were beyond even Zeus's control. Even he could not save his mortal son Sarpedon from his fated death in the Trojan War, though he wept tears of blood at the necessity. The Greeks did not believe in a perfect God who created a perfect world. They believed in powerful beings who were flawed, in a cosmos that was beautiful but dangerous, in a world where meaning came not from divine perfection but from human struggle against limitation. Their heroes were defined not by avoiding mistakes or defeat but by how they faced them, by continuing despite knowing that failure and death were inevitable. This sensibility shaped the way stories were told and retold, each generation adding new details, emphasizing different aspects, finding new meanings in the ancient patterns. Homer's epics became foundational texts, but playwrights like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides reimagined those stories for the stage, exploring the psychological depths of characters, questioning divine justice, examining the nature of fate and free will. Philosophers debated what the myths meant, whether the gods were real or metaphors, what virtues the heroes truly embodied. The myths became a common language through which the Greeks explored fundamental questions. What makes a life worth living? How should we respond to injustice? What obligations do we have to family, to community, to the divine? Can we escape our fate, and should we try? What is the proper balance between pride and humility, between individual glory and collective good, between human ambition and divine law? Different regions emphasized different deities and stories. Athens celebrated Athena and Theseus. Sparta honored Artemis and the Dioscuri, Castor and Polydeuces. Thebes had its own founding myths involving Cadmus, who sowed dragon's teeth that sprouted into warriors who became the city's first citizens. Delphi was sacred to Apollo, and pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean to consult his oracle. Olympia hosted games every 4 years in Zeus's honor, bringing together athletes from all Greek cities in peaceful competition. These shared myths and religious practices created a sense of unity among people who were politically divided into hundreds of independent city-states. A person from Athens and a person from Corinth might be enemies in war, but they both honored the same gods, knew the same stories, recognized the same heroes as part of their collective heritage. The gods were everywhere in daily life, not distant abstractions but immediate presences. You would pour a libation to Dionysus before drinking wine. You would pray to Hermes before setting out on a journey. Sailors would sacrifice to Poseidon for safe passage. Farmers would honor Demeter at planting and harvest. Before battle, you would seek favorable omens and make offerings to Ares or Athena depending on what kind of warfare you anticipated. Marriage was sacred to Hera. Birth was under Eileithy's protection. The hearth fire, center of the home, was Hestia herself, never to be allowed to go out. Festivals marked the year, each dedicated to different gods and telling different stories through ritual, sacrifice, and performance. The Dionysia in Athens featured theatrical competitions where tragedies and comedies explored mythological themes. The Eleusinian Mysteries, secret rites dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates a better fate in the afterlife, though we know almost nothing of what occurred in these ceremonies because the participants kept the secrets so well. The myths were also moral and practical guides. The story of Icarus, son of Daedalus, warned against recklessness and ignoring wise counsel. Daedalus, imprisoned by Minos after helping Theseus escape the labyrinth, fashioned wings from feathers and wax for himself and his son so they could fly to freedom. He warned Icarus not to fly too close to the sea, where moisture would weigh down the feathers, nor too close to the sun, which would melt the wax. But Icarus, exhilarated by flight, ignored his father's warnings and soared higher and higher until the sun's heat melted his wings. He fell into the sea and drowned, giving his name to the Icarian Sea. The message was clear: follow the middle path, heed those who are wiser, understand your limitations. Yet paradoxically, the Greeks also celebrated those who reached beyond limitations, who attempted the impossible even knowing they would fail. They honored Prometheus despite his eternal punishment, because he had elevated humanity at cost to himself. They remembered Heracles not just for his successful labors but for continuing despite suffering, grief, and madness. They admired Odysseus for his determination to return home no matter how long it took or how much he lost along the way. This tension between accepting limits and transcending them, between yielding to fate and fighting against it, was never resolved because it could not be resolved. It was the fundamental paradox of existence, and the myths honored both sides of it, acknowledging that wisdom required knowing when to accept and when to resist, when to be humble and when to be bold, when to honor the gods and when to trust your own judgment. The myths also acknowledged that life was fundamentally tragic, that suffering was inevitable, that loss would come no matter how careful or virtuous you were. but they suggested that this did not make life meaningless. Instead, it made moments of beauty, connection, and triumph all the more precious because they were fleeting. Achilles' choice of a short glorious life over a long quiet one was presented not as obviously right or wrong but as a legitimate choice, a valid way of finding meaning in mortality. Orpheus, the legendary musician whose songs could charm all living things, descended to the underworld to retrieve his wife Eurydice, who had died from a snake bite on their wedding day. His music was so moving that it softened Hades' heart, something almost impossible to do. The Lord of the Dead agreed to let Eurydice return to life on one condition: Orpheus must walk ahead of her on the journey back, and he must not look back at her until they had both reached the surface and sunlight. Orpheus agreed and began the long climb through the darkness. Eurydice followed silently behind him. But as they neared the surface, as the faint light of the world above became visible, doubt seized Orpheus. He could not hear her footsteps. What if Hades had deceived him? What if she was not really there? What if he reached the surface only to find himself alone? Unable to bear the uncertainty, he turned to look back, just for a moment, just to be sure. Eurydice was there, right behind him, reaching out to him. But the moment he looked, the condition was broken. She faded like a dream, drawn back down into the depths, dying a second time, and Orpheus could only watch her disappear, her last word a whisper of his name, not accusatory but sorrowful. He tried to return, tried to descend again, but Charon would not ferry him across a second time. Orpheus lived the rest of his life in mourning, his songs now filled with grief, until he was eventually torn apart by Maenads, followers of Dionysus who were enraged that he honored only Apollo and rejected all other pleasures. The story of Orpheus showed that even love strong enough to challenge death itself could not overcome the fundamental rules of existence. His failure came not from weakness but from being human, from doubt and longing, from the inability to trust completely. It was a tragedy not because Orpheus was evil or foolish, but because he was human, and humans are imperfect, and that imperfection has consequences. These myths lived in the imagination of their culture for over 1,000 years, evolving and adapting but maintaining their essential power. When the Greek city-states were eventually conquered, first by Macedon under Philip and Alexander, then by Rome, the myths did not die. The Romans adopted them wholesale, changing only the names. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, Aphrodite became Venus, and so on. Roman poets like Ovid and Virgil retold the stories, often with new emphases and interpretations that reflected Roman rather than Greek values. Christianity, when it spread through the Mediterranean world, condemned the old gods as demons or false idols, but could not entirely suppress the stories. They persisted in poetry and art, studied by scholars, preserved in manuscripts. During the Renaissance, European culture rediscovered classical mythology with passionate intensity, seeing in these ancient stories profound truths about human nature, timeless artistic inspiration, philosophical wisdom. The myths have never stopped being retold, reinterpreted, reimagined. They appear in Shakespeare's plays, in Milton's poetry, in modern novels and films and television shows. Characters from Greek mythology populate comic books and video games. We still use their names and stories as metaphors. Someone with a fatal weakness has an Achilles heel, an impossible task is Sisyphean, a source of endless trouble is a Pandora's box, a vulnerable point of pride is hubris, a long difficult journey is an odyssey. We return to these stories because they touch something fundamental in the human experience. We recognize in Achilles' rage and grief our own responses to injustice and loss. We see in Odysseus' long struggle to return home our own attempts to find our way through difficulty and confusion to places and people where we belong. We understand Persephone's abduction and Demeter's grief, the cycle of separation and reunion that mirrors countless human experiences. We feel the weight of Sisyphus' eternal task, the sense that our efforts never quite achieve what we hope, yet we continue nonetheless. The gods themselves, with all their flaws and passions, reflect aspects of human psychology projected onto cosmic scale. Zeus's authority and infidelity, Hera's jealousy and wounded dignity, Athena's wisdom and strategic thinking, Aphrodite's beauty and manipulation, Ares's bloodlust and cowardice when truly challenged, Apollo's brilliance and vengefulness, Artemis's independence and protectiveness, Hermes's cleverness and amorality. Each deity embodied certain drives, desires, and characteristics that the Greeks recognized in themselves and others. The myths acknowledged that these aspects of human nature were powerful, perhaps eternal, certainly ineradicable. You could not simply decide not to feel anger, lust, jealousy, pride, or grief. These forces were like gods themselves, demanding acknowledgement and respect, dangerous when ignored or suppressed. The solution was not to deny them but to channel them appropriately, to honor them without being consumed by them, to maintain balance among competing drives and duties. This balance was itself a central theme. The Greeks saw virtue not in extremes but in finding the mean between excess and deficiency. Courage was the balance between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity lay between stinginess and wastefulness. Pride should be neither self-hatred nor hubris. Even pleasure and pain should be balanced, neither indulged nor entirely rejected. The myths illustrated what happened when this balance was lost, when one drive or passion overwhelmed all others. The Caledonian boar hunt illustrated how pride and competition could destroy even the bonds of family and friendship. Ennius, king of Caledon, forgot to honor Artemis in his harvest sacrifices, and the goddess sent an enormous boar to ravage his lands. Ennius called together the greatest heroes of Greece to hunt the beast. They came: Meleager, the king's son; Atalanta, the huntress who had been raised by bears and who could outrun any man; Castor and Polydeuces, Theseus, Jason, Peleus, and many others. The hunt itself was successful, but victory led to disaster. Atalanta struck the first blow, drawing the boar's blood, and Meleager delivered the killing strike. Meleager, who loved Atalanta, awarded her the boar's hide as a trophy, honoring her contribution. But his uncles, his mother's brothers, objected that the hide should go to a blood relative, not to a woman outsider. They tried to take it from Atalanta by force. Meleager, enraged at the insult to her, killed his uncles in her defense. When Meleager's mother Althea learned that her son had killed her brothers, she was torn between maternal love and duty to her birth family. She remembered something from Meleager's birth. The fates had appeared and decreed that Meleager would live only as long as a specific piece of wood burning in the hearth remained unconsumed. Althea had immediately snatched the wood from the fire and kept it safe for years, protecting her son. Now, mad with grief and rage, she threw that piece of wood back into the flames. As it burned, Meleager withered and died, consumed by an invisible fire. Althea, realizing what she had done, hanged herself. The hunt that should have brought glory instead brought only death and sorrow, all because pride would not yield and anger overwhelmed reason. Atalanta's own story continued tragically. She had been exposed as an infant because her father wanted sons, not daughters, but she was nursed by a she-bear sent by Artemis and grew up wild and strong. She became the finest huntress in Greece, devoted to Artemis, sworn never to marry. But her father, having no legitimate sons, eventually claimed her and insisted she marry to provide heirs. Atalanta agreed only if her suitors could beat her in a foot race, and those who lost would be killed. Many young men tried and died, unable to match her speed. Finally, Hippomenes, with Aphrodite's help, carried 3 golden apples from the garden of the Hesperides. During the race, he dropped them one by one, and Atalanta, unable to resist their beauty, stopped to pick them up. These moments of delay allowed Hippomenes to win. They married, but in their passion, or perhaps because Aphrodite was angry that they did not thank her for her help, they made love in a temple of Zeus. The god, outraged at this desecration of his sacred space, transformed them both into lions, which the Greeks believed could not mate with each other, condemning them to remain together but unable to express their love physically. These stories of transformation were common in Greek mythology, moments when the boundary between human and animal, mortal and divine, one substance and another, proved permeable. The gods themselves could change their forms at will, Zeus becoming a bull or swan or shower of gold, Artemis becoming a deer, Poseidon becoming a horse. Mortals could be transformed as punishment or blessing. Callisto, one of Artemis's virgin huntresses, was raped by Zeus and became pregnant. Hera transformed her into a bear, and she would have been killed by her own son while he was hunting, except Zeus took pity and placed both of them in the sky as the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. The nymph Daphne, fleeing from Apollo's unwanted pursuit, prayed to her father, a river god, to save her, and he transformed her into a laurel tree just as Apollo caught up to her. Apollo, mourning the loss of what he desired, made the laurel sacred to himself, and thereafter wore laurel wreaths and decreed that victors in competitions would be crowned with laurel leaves. The story showed both the god's capacity for genuine feeling and his ultimate selfishness. He loved Daphne enough to honor her transformed state, but not enough to have respected her rejection in the first place. Narcissus, a young man of extraordinary beauty, rejected all who loved him, both male and female, showing no capacity for connection with others. The nymph Echo fell in love with him, but she had been cursed by Hera to only repeat the last words spoken to her, unable to express her own thoughts. When Narcissus encountered her in the woods and heard his own words repeated back, he rejected her harshly, and she faded away until only her voice remained, repeating sounds eternally. Nemesis, goddess of retribution, punished Narcissus by making him fall in love with his own reflection in a pool. He lay by that pool, transfixed by the beauty he saw, unable to eat or sleep, slowly dying as he gazed at an image he could never possess. He transformed into the flower that bears his name, forever bending toward the water. These transformation myths explored identity, showing how the essence of a person or their defining characteristic might persist even when their form changed entirely. Io, another of Zeus's lovers, was transformed into a white cow to hide her from Hera's jealousy, but she retained her human consciousness, suffering the indignity of her animal form while unable to communicate her true nature. Hera placed the hundred-eyed giant Argus to guard her, and though Hermes eventually killed Argus and freed Io, Hera sent a gadfly to torment her, driving her in mad wanderings across the world until she finally reached Egypt, where Zeus restored her human form and she bore his son, becoming the ancestress of heroes including Perseus and Heracles. The boundaries between human and divine were complex and sometimes crossable. Heroes could become gods, as Heracles did, or be placed among the stars as constellations. Mortals could bear children to gods, creating demigods who walked between both worlds. Gods could take mortal form and walk among humans unrecognized, testing hospitality and virtue. The story of Baucis and Philemon illustrated this. Zeus and Hermes, disguised as travelers, sought shelter in a Phrygian town where 1,000 households rejected them. Only the elderly couple Baucis and Philemon, poor but generous, welcomed them, offering what little food and drink they had. The gods revealed themselves and destroyed the inhospitable town with a flood, but transformed Baucis and Philemon's humble cottage into a temple and granted their wish that when they died, they would die together, neither outliving the other. When their time came, they simultaneously transformed into intertwining trees, an oak and a linden, standing forever side by side. This story emphasized xenia, sacred hospitality, one of the most important values in Greek culture. A stranger might be a god in disguise, but even if not, they were under Zeus's protection, and to harm or refuse help to a guest or stranger was to offend the king of gods himself. This created a social safety net in a world without hotels or police, where travelers depended on the kindness of strangers, and strangers might later become friends, allies, or trading partners. The myths also explored the nature of justice, though divine justice often looked different from human conceptions of fairness. The gods punished oath-breakers, those who violated sacred bonds, those who showed hubris or failed to honor the divine. But they also acted on whim, out of jealousy or lust, showing favoritism or holding grudges for inscrutable reasons. Justice in Greek mythology was not blind or impartial but personal and relational. The story of Philoctetes illustrated this complexity. Philoctetes was one of the Greek heroes who sailed to Troy, and he possessed Heracles' bow and arrows, which never missed their target. But on the journey, he was bitten by a snake on a sacred island. The wound would not heal and produced such a terrible smell, and his cries of pain were so disturbing that the Greeks, led by Odysseus, marooned him on the deserted island of Lemnos, leaving him alone with his suffering and his bow. For 10 years, Philoctetes survived alone, nursing his undying wound, bitter at his abandonment, especially toward Odysseus who had orchestrated it. Meanwhile, the war at Troy dragged on without resolution. Finally, the Greeks captured a Trojan prophet who revealed that Troy could never be taken without Heracles' bow. So Odysseus had to return to Lemnos, face the men he had wronged, and convince him to rejoin the war. Different playwrights told this part of the story differently. In Sophocles' version, Odysseus tries manipulation and deceit, sending Neoptolemus, Achilles' young son, to trick Philoctetes into giving up the bow. But Neoptolemus, moved by Philoctetes' suffering and nobility, refuses to complete the deception. Finally, Heracles himself appears as a deus ex machina, a god arriving to resolve the situation, and tells Philoctetes that if he goes to Troy, his wound will be healed and he will win great glory. Philoctetes agrees, and at Troy, his arrows finally kill Paris, the men whose lust for Helen had started the entire war. The story asked difficult questions. Was Odysseus right to abandon Philoctetes for the good of the army? Was Philoctetes justified in his refusal to help those who had wronged him, even though others would suffer for it? Can old wrongs be set aside for a greater purpose? What is the relationship between justice and necessity? The myth offered no simple answers but presented the dilemma in all its complexity. Greek mythology was full of such moral ambiguities, situations where competing goods conflicted, where the right action was unclear, where trying to do good led to harm. Agamemnon's choice to sacrifice Iphigenia pitted duty to his men and his oath against duty to his daughter. Antigone's choice to bury her brother defied legitimate civic authority to honor divine and familial duty. Orestes' choice to avenge his father by killing his mother was both commanded by Apollo and prohibited by the natural law against matricide. The Furies pursued Orestes for his crime. As was their nature, they punished those who spilled family blood, maintaining the ancient order of blood vengeance. But Apollo defended him, arguing that he had acted righteously in avenging his father. The conflict was resolved only when Athena established a new court, the Areopagus, where a jury of Athenian citizens would judge such cases, with Athena casting the deciding vote in Orestes' favor. She then convinced the Furies to accept a new role, becoming the Eumenides, the kindly ones, protectors of Athens rather than pursuers of vengeance. This myth justified Athens' legal system and showed the evolution from blood vengeance to trial by jury, from ancient chaos to civilized order, though the play acknowledged that the old ways, the Furies' righteous anger, were not simply wrong but had to be honored and incorporated into the new system. This ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, to acknowledge the validity of conflicting claims, was characteristic of Greek thought at its best. The myths did not insist on single interpretations or simple morals. They were rich enough to support multiple readings, to mean different things to different people, to offer new insights upon reflection and retelling. Some myths were primarily ideological, explaining why things are the way they are. Why do we have winter? Because Persephone spends part of the year in the underworld. Why do spiders spin webs? Because Athena transformed the weaver Arachne. Why is there a constellation called the Bear? Because Zeus placed Callisto in the sky. Why do we see a river of stars across the night sky, the Milky Way? Because Hera, nursing the infant Heracles who was brought to her while she slept, woke suddenly and pushed him away, and her milk sprayed across the heavens. Other myths were more psychological or philosophical, exploring aspects of human nature and divine nature. The contest between Apollo and Marsyas illustrated the dangers of challenging the gods and the cruel side of divine pride. Marsyas was a satyr, part man and part goat, who found the flute that Athena had invented and then discarded after the other gods mocked the face she made while playing it. Marsyas became incredibly skilled with the instrument and foolishly challenged Apollo to a musical contest, with the muses as judges. They agreed that the winner could do whatever he wished to the loser. The contest was close, but Apollo added singing to his lyre playing, something Marsyas could not do with the flute, giving himself an unfair advantage. Apollo won, and as his prize, he flayed Marsyas alive, hanging his skin in a cave as a warning against presumption. The story was brutal and disturbing, showing the gods not as perfect beings but as dangerously powerful entities whose pride could not be challenged without terrible consequences. Yet it also honored Marsyas' skill and courage, even in his defeat. His blood and the tears of those who mourned him became the river Marsyas, flowing forever through Phrygia. The Greeks did not shy away from darkness in their myths. They told stories of incest, cannibalism, infanticide, rape, betrayal, and cruelty. These were not sanitized tales for children but complex narratives for adults trying to make sense of a difficult world. The myth of Tantalus, who killed his son Pelops, cut him into pieces, and served him to the gods to test their omniscience, showed the depths of human depravity and divine punishment. The gods detected the crime and were horrified, except for Demeter, distracted by grief over Persephone, who ate part of the shoulder. The gods restored Pelops to life, replacing the eaten shoulder with one made of ivory, and condemned Tantalus to eternal torment. But Pelops's restoration did not end the curse on his line. He won the hand of Hippodamia by defeating her father in a chariot race, but only by bribing the father's charioteer Myrtilos to sabotage the king's chariot, causing his death. Pelops then killed Myrtilos to eliminate the witness, and Myrtilos cursed Pelops's descendants with his dying breath. This curse would play out through generations. Pelops's sons Atreus and Thyestes fought for the throne of Mycenae, with Atreus eventually killing Thyestes' children and serving them to their father in a stew. Thyestes, learning what he had eaten, cursed Atreus' line. Atreus' sons were Agamemnon and Menelaus, and we know their fates. Agamemnon murdered by his wife, his death avenged by his children in an act that brought its own pollution and punishment. These multi-generational curses showed the Greek understanding that the sins of the fathers could be visited upon the children, that violence begets violence, that breaking sacred laws created pollution that affected not just the perpetrator but their entire family line. Yet the myths also showed individuals within these cursed families making their own choices, for good or ill, suggesting that fate and free will were somehow both operative, intertwined in ways that defied simple understanding. The riddle of the Sphinx, which Oedipus answered, was itself a metaphor for this mystery. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? Man, who crawls as an infant, walks upright in maturity, and uses a cane in old age. The answer was humanity itself, the creature who changes yet remains the same, subject to inevitable aging and decline yet capable of knowledge and choice. Oedipus, who solved this riddle, could not solve the riddle of his own fate, could not see the truth about himself until it was too late, suggesting that we can have knowledge about humanity in general while remaining blind to our own particular circumstances. The oracle at Delphi, entrance to Apollo's most important shrine, bore the inscription, "Know thyself." This Delphic maxim suggested that self-knowledge was the highest wisdom, yet the myths repeatedly showed how difficult, perhaps impossible, true self-knowledge was. We are blind to our own faults, driven by passions we do not fully understand, shaped by forces, social, familial, divine, beyond our control or even our awareness. Yet the imperative remained: strive to know yourself, to understand your nature, your limitations, your proper place in the order of things. Another inscription at Delphi read, "Nothing in excess," reinforcing the Greek value of moderation and balance. Excess in any direction was dangerous. Too much pride became hubris. Too much passion led to destructive obsession. Too much caution became cowardice. Too much courage became recklessness. The myths illustrated this again and again, showing heroes and ordinary people destroyed not by simple evil but by taking any virtue or quality too far, by losing balance. Yet paradoxically, the Greek gods themselves embodied excess. Zeus's lust was excessive. Hera's jealousy was excessive. Ares's love of violence was excessive. Dionysus represented deliberate abandonment of moderation, ecstatic transcendence of normal limits. Perhaps this was the point: the gods could afford excess because they were immortal, because consequences that would destroy a mortal were survivable for them. Or perhaps the gods' excesses were warnings, showing in exaggerated form the dangers of letting any single passion or drive control one's behavior. The festivals of Dionysus allowed controlled release of these excessive energies. For a limited time, normal rules were suspended. People could drink, dance, and celebrate with abandon, experience the ecstatic loosening of civilized constraints. But then the festival ended, order was restored, people returned to their normal lives. The god was honored, his domain acknowledged, but then contained, integrated into the larger pattern of civilized life. This integration of the wild and the civilized, the rational and the ecstatic, the ordered and the chaotic, was essential to Greek thought. Apollo and Dionysus, though seemingly opposite, one representing reason, light, order, prophecy, the other representing wine, madness, theater, ecstasy, were both necessary. Nietzsche would later theorize these as the Apollonian and Dionysian principles, arguing that great art and culture required both the rational form-giving clarity of Apollo and the creative dissolution of boundaries represented by Dionysus. The theater itself embodied this integration. Tragedies were performed at festivals of Dionysus, but they explored rational moral questions, showed the consequences of excess, examined the nature of fate and justice. The chorus, representing the community's voice, commented on the action with measured wisdom, while the individual characters experienced passion, made choices, suffered consequences. The audience, watching, experienced both identification with the characters' suffering and the distancing perspective of the observers, both emotional immersion and rational reflection. Comedy, also performed at Dionysian festivals, had its own wisdom. Aristophanes' plays mocked politicians, intellectuals, gods, and traditional values with bawdy humor and absurd situations. This licensed mockery was itself a kind of safety valve, allowing criticism and questioning that might be dangerous in other contexts, acknowledging that even sacred things could be laughed at, that laughter was itself a form of wisdom and a necessary balance to the seriousness of tragedy. The myths provided material for both tragic and comic treatment. The same story could be told seriously or parodied, emphasizing different aspects. Zeus's numerous affairs with mortals could be treated as examples of divine power overriding human consent, or as comic cuckoldry of Hera, or as sacred unions producing heroes, depending on the context and the teller's purpose. This flexibility and multiplicity of meaning characterized Greek mythology throughout its long life. There was no single canonical version of most myths, no sacred text that could not be questioned or reinterpreted. Homer and Hesiod provided influential versions, but later poets and playwrights felt free to change details, add episodes, emphasize different themes. Regional variations existed, with local heroes and lesser-known gods having their own stories specific to particular places. Some gods had origins outside Greece, imported through trade or conquest and integrated into the pantheon. Dionysus may have come from Thrace or Asia Minor. Aphrodite had connections to Near Eastern goddesses like Ishtar and Astarte. The Greeks were not precious about the purity of their mythology but readily adopted and adapted stories and deities from other cultures, finding ways to fit them into their existing framework. This openness extended to philosophical reinterpretation. By the classical period, some thinkers were proposing that the gods were metaphors rather than literal beings, that Zeus represented the sky or ultimate cosmic principle, that the myths encoded natural philosophy or moral teachings in narrative form. Others defended more traditional understandings, insisting that the gods were real beings who demanded proper worship and sacrifice. These debates coexisted, with people holding various positions along the spectrum from literal belief to complete skepticism. The mystery religions offered initiates secret knowledge and special blessings, promising better fates in the afterlife. The Eleusinian mysteries, focused on Demeter and Persephone, were the most famous, but there were also Orphic mysteries, Dionysian mysteries, and others. These complemented rather than replaced traditional religion, offering deeper personal spiritual experience for those who sought it while maintaining public religious practices that unified the community. Philosophy itself grew partly from meditation on the myths. Plato famously criticized Homer and the poets for portraying the gods as immoral, arguing that the divine must be perfectly good and therefore the myths must be false or allegorical. Yet Plato also created his own myths, the cave allegory, Air's vision of the afterlife, the story of Atlantis, using narrative to convey truths that could not be captured in pure logic. Aristotle analyzed tragedy's psychological and moral effects. The Stoics reinterpreted myths as allegories of natural philosophy or ethical principles. The Epicureans argued that fear of the gods was itself harmful, that the gods, if they existed, did not concern themselves with human affairs. But for most people throughout the Greek world, the myths remained living stories, meaningful at multiple levels simultaneously. They were entertainment, moral instruction, religious truth, cultural identity, and philosophical speculation all at once. A farmer sacrificing to Demeter at harvest time believed the goddess was real and would bless or curse his crops based on proper ritual. A playwright exploring Medea's psychology used the mythic framework to examine passion, betrayal, and revenge in ways that illuminated real human experience. A philosopher might discuss Zeus as the cosmic mind that orders all things. All these approaches coexisted, none canceling out the others. This rich ambiguity, this tolerance for multiple meanings and interpretations, helped the myths endure. They were not dogma to be defended but stories to be told, retold, questioned, reimagined. They belonged to everyone who knew them and could find in them whatever meanings they needed. As the Greek world eventually faded, conquered by Rome, converted to Christianity, its political power dispersed, the myths persisted, handed down through manuscripts preserved by monks who saw in classical literature valuable knowledge despite its pagan origins. Arabic scholars translated and preserved Greek texts. Byzantine scholars maintained the language and traditions. When the Renaissance rediscovered classical learning, the myths exploded back into European consciousness with renewed vitality. Artists painted scenes from mythology. Sculptors carved the gods and heroes. Writers from Chaucer to Shakespeare to Milton drew on mythological themes. The myths became a common vocabulary for discussing human experience across cultures that no longer worshiped the Greek gods. A painting of Icarus's fall could speak to anyone about ambition and its consequences. A reference to Pandora's box communicated instantly the idea of releasing uncontrollable troubles. Narcissus gave us a term for self-absorption. Oedipus' complex entered psychology. The myths proved deeper than any particular religious belief, tapping into archetypal patterns that resonated across time and culture. Modern retellings continue this tradition, finding new relevance in ancient stories. The Odyssey has been retold as a modern novel set in Dublin, as science fiction, as countless variations on the theme of the difficult journey home. The Trojan War has been reimagined from different perspectives, giving voice to women whose views were marginalized in the original telling, questioning the glory of war, exploring the political machinations behind the fighting. Orpheus and Eurydice's tragic love appears in music, theater, film, always moving because it speaks to universal fears of loss and the impossibility of undoing death. Perhaps the myths endure because they acknowledge truths about human existence that we still recognize. We still feel the tension between individual desire and social duty. We still struggle with pride and its consequences. We still face choices where every option has costs, where trying to do right can lead to harm, where our knowledge is always incomplete and our judgment fallible. We still love and lose, hope and despair, strive and fail and sometimes succeed. We still live in a world we did not create and cannot fully control, subject to forces beyond our understanding, if no longer the literal gods of Olympus, then history, genetics, economics, climate, chance, the accumulated weight of others' choices, the unintended consequences of our own actions. We still ask what makes a life meaningful, how to face mortality, what we owe to each other, what is worth sacrificing for, whether anything transcends our brief existence. The Greek myths do not answer these questions definitively. They explore them, complicate them, show them from multiple angles. They offer not solutions but companionship in the questioning, stories that say, humans have always wondered these things, have always struggled with these tensions, have always sought meaning in the face of suffering and death. The myths remind us that we are not the first to face these challenges, that our ancestors millennia ago felt what we feel, feared what we fear, hoped as we hope. They connect us to that long chain of human consciousness, the conversation across generations about what it means to be human, mortal, aware of our limitations yet dreaming of transcendence. And so we return to them again and again, finding in Zeus's thunderbolts and Poseidon's earthquakes and Hades' dark realm metaphors for the powers that shape our lives. We see in Prometheus's defiance the human refusal to accept limitation without question. We recognize in Sisyphus's eternal task the repetitive labors that fill our days. We understand Orpheus's backward glance, the moment of doubt that undoes everything. We feel Persephone's dual existence, split between different worlds, different obligations, different seasons of the soul. These stories from the ancient Aegean, born in a culture long vanished, speak still because they speak truly about things that do not vanish: love and death, courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly, justice and vengeance, fate and choice, the search for home and meaning, the difficult path between excess and deficiency, between resignation and hubris, between accepting the world as it is and daring to imagine it differently. The myths acknowledge that life is difficult and often tragic, that we will make mistakes and suffer consequences, that we will lose what we love, that we will all die, that much of what happens is beyond our control. But they also celebrate moments of beauty, connection, courage, love, creativity, perseverance, all the things that make the struggle worthwhile even when we know how it must end. They suggest that how we face our fate matters more than what that fate is, that dignity can be maintained in suffering, that love can be profound even when it ends, that the journey can be meaningful even if the destination disappoints, that we can act with honor even in impossible situations. They show us heroes who are flawed, gods who are limited, a cosmos that is beautiful but not necessarily just, and they suggest that this is enough, that perfection is not necessary for meaning, that we can embrace existence even while acknowledging its difficulties and tragedies. From chaos, the primordial void, emerged Gaia and the first beings, and from them came the Titans, and from the Titans came the Olympian gods, and from gods and mortals came heroes, and from all of them came stories, stories that shaped culture and consciousness, that gave meaning to experience, that connected individuals to community and community to cosmos, that entertained and educated, that comforted and challenged, that endured when empires fell and beliefs changed because they touched something essential and eternal in human nature. As night falls and stars emerge, the same stars the ancient Greeks looked upon and named after their heroes and monsters, we can feel that connection across millennia. Orion still hunts across the winter sky. The Pleiades still cluster together. Andromeda still stretches her chained arms toward Perseus. The Great Bear still circles the pole. These patterns, unchanging despite everything else that changes, remind us that we share the same sky, the same earth, the same basic human experience as those who first told these stories so long ago. And so, kind listener, we come to the end of this long journey through the realms of Greek mythology, through the ages of gods and titans, through the labors of heroes and the tragedies of royal houses, through love and war, triumph and disaster, glory and shame, life and death and the shadowy existence beyond. We have walked through these ancient stories as one might walk through a vast landscape, sometimes pausing to examine details, sometimes stepping back to see larger patterns, always aware that much remains unexplored, that every story could be told in greater depth, from different perspectives, with different emphases. These myths were never meant to be complete or finished. They were living traditions, constantly retold and reimagined, belonging to everyone who knew them and each person finding in them what they needed. That tradition continues still. The stories remain open, waiting for new listeners, new tellers, new interpretations that honor the past while speaking to the present. The ancient Greeks understood something profound about stories, that they are how we make sense of chaos, how we find patterns in experience, how we connect past to present to future, how we share wisdom across generations, how we create meaning in a cosmos that does not automatically provide it. The myths were their way of saying, this is what we have learned about being human, about living and dying, about facing the unknown with courage even when courage is not enough, about finding beauty in transience and meaning in mortality. As you rest now, perhaps drifting towards sleep, perhaps simply sitting quietly with these ancient stories settling into your consciousness, know that you have shared in something very old and very human, an inheritance passed down through countless generations, stories that have outlived empires and religions and will likely outlive our own age as well, because they speak to something essential that does not change even as everything around us changes. The gods may no longer rule from Olympus, may no longer receive sacrifices at marble temples, but the questions they embodied, the forces they represented, remain with us. We still face storms and must find courage. We still love and risk loss. We still create and destroy. We still seek wisdom and make foolish choices. We still hope despite uncertainty. We still tell stories to understand it all. And in that telling and listening, in that sharing of stories across time and space, we find connection, meaning, comfort in our common humanity. We are all, in our own ways, on odysseys, seeking home. We all face labors that test our strength and spirit. We all love and lose. We all wonder about our place in the vast cosmos. We all try to live well within our limits while sometimes dreaming of transcending them. The myths of ancient Greece gave one culture's answers, or rather, one culture's questions beautifully expressed. They do not tell us what to think or believe, but they offer companionship in the wondering, fellow travelers on the long human journey toward understanding who we are and what we are meant to do with this brief, precious, difficult, beautiful life. So rest now, kind listener. Let these stories drift through your mind like ships on wine-dark seas, like heroes on long journeys home, like souls crossing the river Styx, like Persephone ascending each spring to bring light and life to the world again. The stories will be here when you wake, as they have been for 3,000 years, as they will be for generations yet to come. They are patient, eternal, waiting like Penelope at her loom, weaving and unweaving, creating meaning from the threads of human experience. Thank you for sharing this journey through the mists of myth and memory, through the realm where gods walked among mortals and heroes strove against fate itself. May you find rest, peace, and perhaps in dreams, your own encounters with the timeless truths that these ancient stories still whisper to those who listen. Sleep well, and may the gods, whatever form they take in your own understanding, watch over you through the night, and may you wake refreshed, renewed, ready to face your own labors and adventures, carrying with you the wisdom of those who came before, the knowledge that you are part of a story much larger and older than yourself, a story that continues still, that includes you, that will go on when you are gone. the great human story of which Greek mythology was one beautiful, enduring chapter. Good night, kind listener. The stars shine on, eternal witnesses to all our stories.